Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something as dreamy as it is deadly. Romance in the Middle Ages. But before you imagine candlelit halls and roses at dawn, let me be real with you. Falling in love back then wasn't just dramatic, it was downright dangerous. Like, you probably won't survive this kind of dangerous. We're talking scandal, sword fights, prison, and even executions. All for a little kiss or secret note passed under a chapel pew. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments what city you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're born in a world where love isn't a fairy tale, it's a minefield. It's the early 12th century. The Middle Ages are still trudging through mud-stained boots and ironclad morality, and you're growing up in a world where everyone already knows who you're going to marry by the time you can barely spell your own name. Not because of compatibility or butterflies, but because your family made a deal, usually involving land, alliances, or livestock. So love, that's not on the official menu, but here's the twist. Despite all the practicality and pressure, people still fall in love. Like deep, heart-wrenching, bad decision-making kind of love. And that tension between the real and the romantic births one of the most iconic and misunderstood cultural phenomena of the era, courtly love. Now imagine this. You're a noblewoman. You're technically married, sure, but your husband is always off at war or just disinterested in anything that isn't hunting boars. One day, a young knight, maybe a bit too poetic for his own good, comes around singing about your hair and how your smile could conquer dragons. He leaves little poems with suspiciously familiar metaphors. He catches your eye at the feast and raises his goblet in your direction. You pretend not to notice, but you totally do. That's courtly love. It's all about admiration, longing, and supposedly unconsummated affection. The ideal was pure and noble. He worships you from afar, writes songs about your beauty, swears fealty to your favour in battle. It's like emotional yoga, all the stretching, none of the action. The whole thing is supposed to stay platonic, but let's be honest, sometimes it didn't. Here's where it gets spicy. These little romantic games weren't just risky, they could literally kill you. You see, most marriages were contracts. Breaching them, especially if you're a woman, meant shame, legal action, or death. Even just entertaining the idea of someone else, even in poetry, could be taken as proof of adultery. And that's not a charge people took lightly. Meanwhile, troubadours, the medieval equivalent of TikTok sad boys, travelled from court to court, singing songs about tragic longing and the noble pain of forbidden love. Their songs were the era's rom-coms, except they usually ended with the knight dead in a ditch, or the lady banished to a convent. Still, the whole thing caught on, especially in places like southern France and northern Italy. Young nobles started believing in the idea that love was supposed to hurt, that suffering for someone out of reach was the highest emotional achievement. You don't just love someone. You adore them, ache for them, compose an entire lute ballad about the way their shadow looked at dusk. This may sound poetic, but here's the problem. It messes with the already precarious balance of power. In a society where every marriage is a chess move, and every flirtation could destabilise years of diplomacy, love becomes dangerous not just personally, but politically. If the Count's daughter falls for the blacksmith's apprentice, it's not a Hallmark movie, it's a scandal that could result in bloodshed. And don't get too cosy with the idea that men had it easier. They didn't. A young knight caught making eyes at the baron's wife could find himself on the wrong end of a lance, or sent to a monastery faster than you can say unrequited. Love, in this age, is a high-stakes gamble, where the odds are rigged, and the house usually wins. One historical fact. The concept of courtly love really gained steam in Eleanor of Aquitaine's court, where poets and thinkers romanticised idealised affection. Eleanor herself was married to 2 kings, and had a complicated love life that might have inspired half the drama in medieval poetry. She helped shape this cultural movement, but even in her high status, she wasn't immune to political blowback. At one point, she was imprisoned by her own husband, King Henry II, for allegedly encouraging their sons to rebel. Love and politics, never clean. Now, here's a fringe gem for you. Some medieval love manuals existed, actual guides on how to woo someone properly. One of the weirdest examples comes from Andreas Capellanus' The Art of Courtly Love, which includes bizarre advice like, love cannot exist in the married state, and outlines a very specific class-based approach to seduction. Picture a medieval self-help book written by someone who clearly never had a healthy relationship. And of course, no good bedtime story is complete without a little historical debate. Scholars still argue whether courtly love was ever really practiced, or if it was all just a poetic fantasy. Some say it was a genuine code followed by the aristocracy. Others claim it was mostly literary make-believe, a kind of socially acceptable way to talk about longing without ever admitting to scandal. Was it real? Was it just fan fiction of the nobility? The truth probably lives somewhere in between a rose garden and a locked tower. So here you are, surrounded by castles and codes, navigating a world where falling in love isn't just emotionally risky, it's legally, socially and physically dangerous. You've got songs being written about your eyes, rumours whispering through the halls, and a husband who might not take kindly to poetry involving your dimples. Sleep well knowing this. In the Middle Ages, Cupid didn't just carry arrows, he carried consequences. You're walking through the cloistered halls of a medieval castle, damp stone underfoot, and a draft that's always just cold enough to make you question your life choices. You're not royalty, yet you're well connected enough to be in the thick of noble life. And tonight, someone's whispering about another scandal, one that's already got 2 maids dismissed and a knight summoned before the Lord himself. The charge? A secret liaison. Translation: forbidden love. Here's the hard truth. If you fall for someone you're not supposed to, it's not just frowned upon, it's dangerous. As in, your life could end, painfully and publicly. Romantic relationships outside of marriage weren't just disapproved of, they were criminal. Affairs, especially among the noble class, could lead to charges of adultery, treason or worse. And it didn't matter if it was mutual or not. Once the rumour mill got hold of a flirtation, the consequences started snowballing. Let's paint the picture. You're a young lady of the court, technically married to a man twice your age, chosen for you because of his property holdings. He's always away or drunk, maybe both. Then there's the new squire, earnest, poetic, impossibly blue-eyed. You pass each other in the hall. One day he drops a glove. You pick it up and your fingers brush. The moment barely lasts a second, but someone sees. Now everything gets dangerous. The maid who spotted you? She's loyal to your husband. She whispers to the steward, who tells the chaplain, who tells the lady of the next estate during evening prayer. Within days the whole castle knows, and in the Middle Ages, where surveillance was basically gossip with better acoustics, that's all it took to start an avalanche. Adultery wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a legal offence. If you're a woman caught in an affair, your husband could legally kill you. That's not melodrama. It's codified in several medieval law systems, including Anglo-Saxon and Frankish traditions. Men could also be punished, but their consequences were often lighter. For women, the stakes were existential. You weren't just cheating on your husband, you were endangering the family line, possibly birthing an heir that wasn't his, and in a society obsessed with bloodlines that was nuclear-level betrayal. Of course, sometimes it wasn't the husband you had to worry about. If you were sleeping with someone from another noble house, your love affair might look an awful lot like espionage. That could mean imprisonment in a tower, literal dungeon time, or death by execution. Remember Isabeau of Bavaria, Queen of France, accused of numerous affairs during her husband's mental illness? Some believe the rumours were politically motivated, but even unproven whispers nearly ruined her reign. No one was safe. Now let's flip the coin. Say you're a knight, and you fall in love with the Lord's daughter. Theirs is a name you can't even speak without choking on your own ambition. But you do speak it. In fact, you write it. In a poem that you slip into her psalter. Very smooth. Except now her father knows, and he's not flattered. You're accused of dishonouring her, and since she's technically property until married off, her honour reflects directly on his. If he's merciful, you're sent to fight in a war. If not, you're found hanging by dawn. Love can't compete with power, and it wasn't just the nobility playing these high-stakes games. Even among peasants and townsfolk, romantic scandals could turn ugly fast. In small communities, people lived on top of each other, physically and socially. Everyone knew everyone's business. A miller's daughter sneaking into the woods with a shepherd? If caught, they could be publicly whipped, forced to confess in church or shamed in front of the entire village. Imagine standing barefoot before your parish priest while your neighbours hurl cabbage and judgment. So romantic. Here's a historical fact for your nightmares. In 1395, Marjorie of Hereford was accused of adultery after a neighbour claimed to see a man leave her cottage late at night. Her punishment? She was forced to stand outside the church in a sackcloth dress while the priest read her sins aloud. And that was a mild sentence. Others were branded mutilated or worse. But don't get the idea that all this was always about justice. Sometimes accusations were strategic. If a lord wanted to dispose of an inconvenient wife or an ambitious rival, a whispered allegation of a romantic indiscretion could be a useful tool. Love became weaponized, twisted into a political dagger. The bedroom wasn't private, it was a battlefield. Now for your quirky tidbit, some medieval towns held love courts. Yes, real ones. They didn't dole out legal sentences, but noblewomen would gather to judge cases of romantic suffering. Think of it as aristocratic group therapy mixed with a fanfic forum. These courts would decide whether a knight's love was true, or whether a lady had been cruel in rejecting him. Totally dramatic, totally non-binding, and totally unable to protect anyone from real-world consequences. Of course, modern scholars still argue about how common these lethal outcomes were. Did people really die that often for love? Or are we just obsessed with the juicy outliers? Some historians say that actual executions for affairs were rare and exaggerated in court literature. Others argue they were more common but underreported, especially for lower-class offenders. Either way, the cultural fear of punishment was real, and in the Middle Ages, fear was half the law. So here you are, in love and surrounded by land deals, legal traps, and jealous whispers. You write a note, you sneak a kiss, you dream of a life you can't have. But in this world, even a whisper of affection can cost you everything. Is it worth it? That's the question medieval lovers had to ask themselves every day, and often they answered yes, even when it meant ruin. You wake up to the sound of clanging iron. Someone's forging horseshoes outside your window. It's a reminder that even love has to make way for business here. You live in a world where marriages aren't rooted in passion, romance, or even basic compatibility. Nope. In the Middle Ages, marriage is a transaction, a financial merger, a carefully calculated political strategy wrapped in a church ceremony and a lot of fabric. Whether you're born to a noble family or a modest farming household, your love life is already mapped out long before you're old enough to feel anything resembling infatuation. Your parents don't sit you down with a cup of tea and ask how you feel about the kid down the road. Instead, they negotiate your future like a merchant haggling over a barrel of salted fish. Dowries are discussed. Land is weighed. Political alliances are drawn up. The goal isn't happiness. It's survival, stability, influence, love. That's an optional side quest, and a dangerous one at that. Picture this. You're a young nobleman, maybe 16, and you've just been told you're to marry a girl from a powerful neighbouring family. You've met her exactly once. She was 10 at the time and very concerned about her pet hawk. You're expected to wed her when she turns 12 or 13, which is perfectly normal by medieval standards. The union will secure access to her family's vineyards, ensuring a steady wine supply and a stronger military alliance. You don't get a say. If you protest, you're told to think of the family legacy. Love is for songs, not strategy. Meanwhile, if you're the bride, things aren't any better. You're being handed over like a diplomatic token. Your education has focused more on managing a household and surviving childbirth than on poetry or dreams. The wedding night isn't about romance. It's about consummation, because until that's done, the marriage isn't considered legally binding. And if it isn't consummated, both families could call the whole thing off, which would bring shame, debts, and possibly open conflict. So, you play your role. You smile at the feast, you wear the heavy gown, you endure the toasts and the stares, and inside, maybe, you're aching for someone else. Someone your heart picked, not your parents. That's the cruel paradox of the Middle Ages. Marriage is everywhere, but love is usually somewhere else. People get married to survive and fall in love in spite of it. It's almost expected that if you do feel something real, it'll happen outside your marriage, which again makes things very, very complicated. Historically, this dynamic left room for all kinds of quiet rebellion. Secret lovers, emotional affairs, longing glances during banquets. People found ways to feel something real in the cracks between duty and expectation. Of course, some took it a step further, trying to annul their arranged marriages to pursue love elsewhere. But here's where things get spicy and sad. Getting an annulment wasn't like clicking unsubscribe. It was a grueling legal and spiritual process overseen by the church, often requiring you to prove that your marriage was invalid from the start. Reasons included impotence. Yes, you had to prove that in public. Consanguinity, being too closely related, which, let's be honest, was common among nobles, or coercion. But the church wasn't exactly eager to unravel alliances forged through holy matrimony. If your union benefited powerful families or political factions, your pleas fell on deaf ears. More than once, people trying to escape loveless marriages were accused of heresy or excommunicated altogether. Here's a historical gem. Eleanor of Aquitaine, yes, her again, actually had her first marriage to Louis VII annulled on grounds of consanguinity. But everyone suspected the real reason was that she just couldn't stand him, and had her eye on Henry of Anjou, soon to be Henry II of England. It worked out for her, sort of, but even queens had to bend the rules and risk scandal to follow their hearts. But let's not forget the commoners. Among peasants, things were a little looser, but not by much. Marriages were still arranged, often by fathers and village elders, and economic considerations were front and centre. A good match wasn't about chemistry, it was about cows, or land, or sometimes just proximity. You might get lucky and actually like your spouse, but if you didn't, tough. Divorce wasn't an option, and if you were caught straying, the punishments could be brutal, especially if you were a woman. Here's a quirky nugget. Some regions had rituals that mocked failed or loveless marriages. In parts of France, if a couple didn't consummate their marriage within a certain time, villagers would gather outside their home and bang pots and pans, an obnoxious, very public shaming. It was called charivari, and it was the medieval version of getting roasted by your neighbours for being a disappointment. And just because love wasn't officially part of marriage doesn't mean people didn't crave it. You'd find it in songs, in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, in the careful stitching of a lover's initials into a handkerchief. People still wanted to love and be loved. They just didn't have the institutional support for it. If anything, the danger and impossibility made love feel even more urgent, more desperate, like you had to seize it quickly before the world took it away. One scholarly debate that still floats around like smoke in a candlelit hall. Were people really as emotionally detached from marriage as the documents suggest? Some researchers argue that we've overestimated the coldness of arranged unions, that affection, companionship, even love could grow over time. Others say that's wishful thinking, and the system was fundamentally hostile to romance from the start. Maybe both are true. Maybe it depended on the people, the place, the luck. So here you are, either promised to someone you don't love or already shackled to them, watching the world pass by through a lattice window. You hear laughter from the stables, or catch the scent of rosemary on someone's tunic, and your heart stirs in spite of everything. You think about what it might be like to choose freely. But in the Middle Ages, love is rarely free. It's priced in land, bloodlines, and obedience, and when it shows up uninvited, it often gets punished. You know who's always watching? The church, like always. Eyes in the choir loft, ears in the confession booth, hands in the parchment drawers. In the Middle Ages, falling in love wasn't just socially risky, it was spiritually dangerous. The church saw desire as a loaded crossbow pointed straight at the soul, and they made sure everyone, especially you, understood the consequences. Let's be clear, medieval Christianity had a complex love-hate relationship with love. On the one hand, divine love was sacred, God's love, beautiful, the Virgin Mary's compassion, glorious, but romantic love, especially the messy, lusty kind that makes people do stupid things in gardens at midnight, that was a one-way ticket to hell, unless carefully contained inside marriage, properly blessed and thoroughly guilt-ridden. If you're lucky, or unlucky, enough to be educated in a monastic school, you're taught early on that the body is a vessel of temptation, the flesh, weak, the heart, deceitful. You're warned through parables, sermons, and stained glass windows that desire can ruin not just your life, but your afterlife. And yet, ironically, some of the most beautifully romantic writing of the time comes from monks and nuns wrestling with their own desires. Go figure. By the 12th century, the church is tightening its grip on marriage and love with iron tongs. Before that, marriage was more of a community thing. Families made deals and the local lord might witness it, maybe with a priest on standby. But now the church wants full control. No more backyard vows or secret pacts under the harvest moon. From 1215 on, with the Fourth Lateran Council, marriage becomes a sacrament. That means you need a priest and public witnesses. Secret marriages, not just frowned upon, nullified. Your whispers in the chapel don't count unless the church says so. And don't think for a second that feelings matter. The church isn't interested in your butterflies. They care about legitimacy, of children, of land claims, of inheritances. Love is suspect unless it's disciplined by ritual and sealed with a sermon. Want to marry for love? Well, you'd better be ready to prove that your desire aligns with God's will. Otherwise it's fornication, and fornication is sin. Sin needs confession, or punishment. Now let's talk about sex, because you literally couldn't talk about love in the Middle Ages without opening that can of worms, and then immediately being told to feel guilty about it. According to church doctrine, sex was only acceptable inside marriage, and even then, it had to be for procreation. Doing it for pleasure, that was a slippery slope toward damnation. Some theologians even went so far as to specify acceptable positions. Spoiler, if it sounded fun, it probably wasn't on the list. And yet, people kept doing it. Shocking, right? Despite fire and brimstone sermons, people fell in love, snuck into barns, and found ways to touch the untouchable. And when they got caught, oh boy. The punishments could be spiritual, social, or downright physical. A priest might sentence you to public penance, standing outside church in a shift, ash on your head, tears on your face. You might be barred from communion, excommunicated, or worse, dragged into an ecclesiastical trial and paraded as a cautionary tale. Take the case of Pierre Abelard and Eloise. He's a philosopher and teacher. She's his brilliant young student. They fall in love, and the result is a medieval scandal so intense it still gets analysed in gender studies classes today. Their secret affair leads to a secret child, a secret marriage, and finally a not-so-secret act of violent revenge. Abelard is castrated by Heloise's furious uncle and a few hired thugs. He retreats into monkhood. She becomes a nun. They spend the rest of their lives writing each other heartbreakingly articulate letters, overflowing with longing, philosophy and regret. If anyone ever doubted the danger of medieval love, that story pretty much seals it. Now here's something weird. Despite all the church's rules, love still snuck in through the side door, in prayers, in mystical experiences, in the language of devotion. Some saints described their relationship with God using the same imagery found in romantic poetry. They blushed, they wept, they longed for union. Not in the carnal sense, of course, but still. The vocabulary got suspiciously steamy. The lines between spiritual ecstasy and romantic yearning weren't always as clear as the bishops would have liked. And then there's confession. Oh, confession. The medieval version of airing your dirty laundry to someone with total power over your eternal fate. If you confessed impure thoughts or deeds, you might be forgiven, if you were truly repentant. But you'd also be marked, especially if you were a woman. Female sexuality was viewed as doubly dangerous, capable of tempting men and representing moral weakness. If a man fell into sin, it was often blamed on a woman who led him astray. So yes, love wasn't just dangerous, it was frequently weaponized against women. Some fringe beliefs pushed this even further. There were sects, eventually labelled heretical, that believed love itself could be a path to divine truth. The Cathars, for instance, rejected the material world entirely, including traditional marriage, and believed spiritual love transcended physical bonds. The church didn't like that one bit. Cathars were hunted down, excommunicated, and in many cases burned. Not metaphorically, actually burned. And of course, historians still debate whether the church's messaging really sank in. Did regular folks internalise all that fire and brimstone, or did they just nod along and then go home to their actual feelings? Some scholars argue that the average medieval villager lived a double life, outwardly devout, inwardly human. Others insist that fear of damnation genuinely shaped their emotional choices, keeping people from even considering certain relationships. Hard to know, medieval diaries weren't exactly candid. So here you are again, caught in a web spun from scripture and shame. Maybe you've just realised you're in love with the local reeve's daughter. You see her once a week at Mass, eyes lowered, hair veiled. You feel something stir that no sermon can quiet, but acting on it means risking not just your social standing, but your soul. Love isn't a blessing here, it's a battleground, and the church, it's the referee, the rulebook, and the executioner all in one. You're adjusting the weight of a velvet headpiece that somehow feels like it was designed by someone who'd never worn one. The servants are murmuring in the hallway, the sun's casting long shadows through your stained glass window, and your heart is racing. Not because of your duties, or your dress, or the dozen eyes watching your every move, but because someone just left a lily on your windowsill. It wasn't your husband. If you're a noblewoman in the Middle Ages, falling in love is like dancing blindfolded on a frozen pond. It's thrilling, and sure, there's a chance you'll make it through unscathed. But odds are you're going to fall through the ice, and the water below is icy, bitter, and filled with consequences. Noblewomen walk a tightrope between being admired and being condemned. You're supposed to be beautiful, desirable, inspiring, but only in ways that don't lead to anything real. Courtly love rules say you can be adored from afar, written about in ballads and honoured in tournaments, but the moment admiration turns to action, that's when the entire house of cards collapses. And yet, you want more. Not just admiration, not just bows from suitors and polite smiles at banquets. You want to be known, touched, whispered to. And so, like many before you, you test the waters. Maybe you let the night linger a moment too long in your chambers. Maybe your eyes meet. Across the feasting table one too many times. It's small, harmless even. But this is the Middle Ages, where harmless is just danger dressed in pearls. Take the story of Queen Isabella of France. She was married to King Edward II, who, let's just say, wasn't exactly attentive in the way a medieval king was expected to be. Rumours flew about his preferences and favouritism toward his male companions. Isabella, after years of humiliation, found solace in a man named Roger Mortimer. Their affair wasn't just scandalous, it was political dynamite. Eventually they led a rebellion against Edward, had him deposed, and possibly murdered. A love affair that literally toppled a king. That's not poetry, that's history. But for most noblewomen, things don't end with rebellion and regency. They end with banishment, forced confessions, and, if you're lucky, confinement to a convent. If you're not lucky, public execution, burning, stoning. Honour killings weren't just a thing in distant lands. They happened in the castles of Europe, dressed up in respectability and justice. What makes this all worse is that noblewomen are constantly watched. You have ladies in waiting, guards, attendants, and even nuns looking over your shoulder. Privacy is non-existent. Your letters are intercepted. Your messengers are bribed. Your secrets, leaked before you can say, "This never happened." And when suspicion arises, your body becomes evidence. Midwives and clerics are called in to examine you, to look for signs of impropriety. Yes, it gets that invasive. One bizarre historical fact. In the 14th century, Margaret of Hainault, accused of infidelity, was subjected to a bizarre ritual where she had to walk barefoot and bareheaded to prove her innocence. The idea was that God would strike her down if she lied. Spoiler, he didn't. But that didn't mean her reputation was restored. The stain lingered, even when the evidence didn't. And heaven help you if you get pregnant, because now the proof is undeniable, and your child is a threat to the whole noble line. If your lover is from a lower class, the baby could be seen as illegitimate, unfit to inherit, and yet still dangerous enough to provoke civil unrest. Some women were forced to take vows just to make the baby disappear. Others were quietly executed before they could give birth. Again, this isn't Gothic fiction. This was real life for too many women whose only crime was following their hearts. The problem isn't just the punishment, it's the double standard. Men could be passionate, even reckless, and still get praised for it. Their affairs were seen as indulgences, sometimes even signs of virility. But for women, one misstep and you're branded a harlot, a temptress, a disgrace. Love isn't just dangerous. It's a weapon that can be turned against you with brutal efficiency. Yet despite it all, noble women found ways to love. Letters were hidden in sleeves. Tokens were sewn into hems. Secret codes were used in embroidery, and sometimes they were bold. They made choices that risked everything, from their status to their lives. because the hollow, gilded cage of their marriages was simply too much. And even if their stories didn't survive in chronicles, they whispered their truths into the walls of their towers, into poems penned by heartbroken lovers, into lullabies sung to children who might never know their real fathers. There's a scholarly debate about just how much agency noblewomen really had. Some historians argue they were powerless, completely at the mercy of their husbands and families. Others suggest they were more politically savvy than we give them credit for, masters of manipulation, alliance, and quiet rebellion. Maybe both are true. Maybe survival demanded both submission and strategy, depending on the moment. So now imagine you're sitting in your solar, pretending to sew while your thoughts are 1,000 miles away. You think about the knight who smiled at you in the garden. You think about what it would mean to reach for him. You know the risks. You've seen the punishments. But still, you dream. Because in a world where everything's decided for you, choosing who to love feels like the only decision that's actually yours. And so you lean a little closer when he walks by. You accept the lily on your windowsill. You risk it all for a flicker of connection in a cold, calculated world. Because love isn't safe here. It never was. But sometimes, it's the only thing that feels real. You're at a harvest fair, and the music is playing. A lilting pipe and a drum, the kind that makes feet tap before heads can object. The fields have been kind this season, and there's bread, cheese, and a little wine. For just a moment life feels easy. But then you see it. A boy from the next village, shirt loose, hair a bit too long, grinning like he doesn't care what he's supposed to be. And suddenly, your world shifts. Problem is, you're the daughter of a reeve. He's a tanner's apprentice. And in the Middle Ages, falling in love across class lines is more than just awkward. It's dangerous. The rules are clear, even if they're not written down in any single book. You marry within your station, peasants marry peasants, merchants marry merchants, nobles marry nobles. The boundaries are as fixed as the hedgerows, and just as sharp if you try to cross them. Because while the Middle Ages might seem rigid from a modern view, they were actually deeply obsessed with order. Divine, social and legal order. Everyone in their place, like stones in a carefully built wall. And if one of those stones shifts, say, for love, the whole structure could be threatened. You might not be a princess, but you're still spoken for. Your father's arranged for you to marry a miller's son next spring. He has decent hands, a cow, and enough grain to keep you warm through winter, but he's not him. The tanner's boy. He makes you laugh in a way that's rare in this hard, heavy world. He talks about the stars, asks you if you've ever seen a heron's nest. He's trouble, and you know it. If your father finds out you're spending time with someone below your intended rank, he'll lose his mind. Not because he's cruel, though he might be, but because your marriage has implications. Dowries, alliances, family reputation, your currency, whether you feel like it or not. Love messes up the exchange rate. Now imagine you're on the other side of that line. You're a squire, young, ambitious, dirt under your nails but stars in your eyes. And the girl you like, she's the daughter of a baron. You pass her in the stables sometimes. She smells like jasmine and parchment. She smiles like she's trying not to smile. And for a second, you believe the ballads, that maybe love can rise above your place. But here's the harsh reality. Your feelings aren't charming. They're threatening. If anyone finds out you're not the underdog in a love story, you're a liability, a nobody with dreams above his station. And trust me, that doesn't end with a wedding. It ends with you missing some teeth, or a tongue, or simply disappearing into the woods and never coming back. One actual historical case? Let's talk about Agnes Hoto, a noblewoman in the 14th century England who disguised herself as a man to fight in a duel in her father's place. Yes, that happened. And it wasn't just about honour, it was about preserving her family's standing. But rumours swirled that she did it for love. Whether that's true or not, it shows how tangled love, class and reputation could become. One wrong move, and your family's name was mud for generations. And speaking of fringe facts, here's a weird one. In some towns, if a lower-class man got caught pursuing a noblewoman, he could be forced to parade through the streets wearing donkey ears and a collar to publicly mark his presumption. People would throw things, chant things. It wasn't just punishment. It was humiliation designed to crush hope at its root. That's the danger of cross-class romance in the Middle Ages. It's not just about two people, it's about property, legacy, bloodlines. And when the stakes are that high, love becomes treasonous, especially if a child is involved. Illegitimate children weren't just personal shame, they were political problems. If a noblewoman had a child with a commoner, it could cause disputes over inheritance, land rights, even fealty to the crown, and yet it still happened. A lot more than the official records suggest, because people are people, no matter the century. And even in a world built on walls, some hearts went climbing. You had runaway marriages, secret ceremonies in moonlit chapels, lovers who fled into the forest to start over as outlaws. Romantic? Sure, but survival rates weren't great. Those woods didn't just have wolves, they had sheriffs. There's still debate among historians about how rigid these class rules really were. Some scholars argue that the boundaries were more flexible in practice, especially during times of social upheaval like after the Black Death, when labour shortages gave peasants more leverage. Others say that's wishful thinking and that class divisions remained firmly entrenched until much later. Maybe both are true. Maybe it all depended on who you were, how rich your father was, and how many people were willing to look the other way. So you sit with your feelings, head down, trying not to meet their eyes. You carry your water, you pluck your herbs, you pretend not to look toward the path that leads past the tannery. But at night, when the village sleeps and the fire crackles low, you let yourself think about what might have been, what could still be, and that small, flickering ember of love. It keeps you warm, even when the world says you're wrong, because maybe the danger is exactly what makes it feel so real. You're sitting under an olive tree, the air thick with late summer dust, and the scent of crushed rosemary. A soft melody drifts over the vineyard wall, someone strumming a lute, half singing, half mourning. The voice doesn't belong to a courtier or a priest. It's a troubadour, one of the most romantically reckless creatures the Middle Ages ever produced. And you? You're trying not to listen too closely, but every verse of that song feels like it was written for you. Maybe it was. This is southern France, circa the 12th century, the birthplace of courtly love's most dramatic PR campaign. Here, troubadours and trouvères travel from court to court, singing about love as if it were the most sacred, most devastating thing in the world. Their verses are rich with longing, coded glances, and poetic despair. But don't get it twisted. These aren't just songs for entertainment. They're social grenades, lobbed into courts where real people live under very real rules. You're a noblewoman in a chilly stone hall. Your husband is out hunting. Again, you sit through another dull meal of barley and boiled meat, half listening to your steward drone about taxes, and then the troubadour steps forward. He sings not of battles or saints, but of you. Not by name, never by name, but everyone knows who he means. The shape of your face, the colour of your gown, the way your laughter breaks the silence of the courtyard. It's all there, delicately wrapped in metaphor and melody. And suddenly, the air in the hall changes. Some pretend not to notice. Others exchange glances. A few smirk. Your cheeks burn, but your heart races. You know what this is. It's a declaration. A risk. Because in this world, songs aren't safe, especially not love songs. Troubadours were both artists and agitators. Their words could elevate or destroy depending on who was listening. In many ways, they were the TikTok influencers of the medieval world, flamboyant, passionate, and perpetually just a few rhymes away from disaster. And if they directed their lyrics at someone important, especially a married woman, it could end in exile, mutilation, or even death. All for a poem. One famous example, the troubadour Guillaume de Cabestan, who fell for his lord's wife. He was discovered, killed, and, according to one particularly gruesome version of the story, his heart was cooked and served to the lady in a stew. When she found out, she threw herself from a tower. That's love in the Middle Ages, poetic, passionate, and deeply unappetizing. But here's the kicker. These songs weren't always real. Sometimes they were entirely fictional, designed to gain favour or stir gossip. A troubadour might pretend to pine for a high-born lady just to make a name for himself, but that didn't matter. Perception was everything. If a song made someone look compromised, it was compromising. Your virtue could be torn apart by a clever chorus and a few well-placed metaphors. There was also a belief, a very medieval, very awkward one, that these songs could inspire ennobling love. That is, by being adored from afar, a woman could inspire a man to become braver, wiser, more virtuous. Sounds romantic, right? except it still reduces her to a symbol, not a person. You weren't expected to respond or reciprocate. You were a muse, not a partner. And if you dared to answer those verses with affection, well, now you're no longer inspirational. You're just inappropriate. Let's not forget how these performances could also backfire for the performers themselves. Troubadours weren't usually rich. They relied on patronage. Basically, getting paid by nobles to entertain and flatter. That meant their lives were precarious. One bad song, one offended lord, and you're out on the road again, hoping someone in the next castle likes your metaphors about hawks and heartbreak. Some fringe scholars believe that certain love songs were actually used to pass secret messages, romantic espionage, if you will. Hidden meanings tucked into verses, coded instructions for illicit affairs, or even rebellions disguised as odes. Did this really happen? Maybe. Maybe not. But the fact that people thought it could is telling. Words had weight, especially in a society where so many other forms of communication were controlled. And then there's the question that still divides historians. How seriously did people take these songs? Were they just medieval soap operas, or did they genuinely shape real-life emotions and decisions? Some argue that the troubadour tradition actually influenced how people felt about love, that it introduced a new kind of emotional vocabulary. Others say it was all theatre, a noble pastime that rarely translated into real passion. But when you read the letters, the poems, the stories that followed, you start to wonder. Because despite the danger, people did respond. They took the risk. Noblewomen wrote back. Young knights scribbled verses in the margins of prayer books. Secret meetings were arranged under moonlit archways. The songs may have started the fire, but real people kept it burning. So here you are again, heart pounding, trying to look indifferent while the troubadour sings. You know the rules. You know this isn't safe. But you also know he means you. His words dance across the notes like fingertips across your spine. And even if nothing ever happens, even if no touch, no kiss, no whispered promise ever follows, this feeling. It's more than enough to make you forget the cold stones and cold dinners and colder marriages, even if just for a moment. Because in the Middle Ages, love songs weren't background music. They were sparks. And sometimes those sparks lit bonfires that no one could put out. You're kneeling by the fire, rolling parchment between your fingers, heart thudding in your throat. It's just ink, just words. But this love letter could get you imprisoned. Or worse. You've spent 3 nights drafting it, rewriting the phrasing over and over, hiding the pages under a floor tile every time someone knocked. It's not even a long letter, but each sentence feels like you're walking a tightrope blindfolded with a torch in your hand. Because in the Middle Ages, writing down your feelings could be the most dangerous move of all. Letters were lifelines. In a world where you couldn't just stroll up and whisper sweet nothings without risking a scandal, ink and parchment became your weapon and shield. Love letters were everywhere, between nobles, between clergy, even between married women and their forbidden favourites. But what started as soft poetry or careful prose could easily become evidence. Because once your words were out there, you couldn't call them back. You send the letter anyway, folded tightly, sealed with wax, pressed with the crest of your family's ring. You slip it to a trusted servant who's been with your household long enough to know when not to ask questions. You tell yourself the risk is worth it. That the person waiting on the other end, waiting in a cold stone chamber maybe, or behind a locked chapel door, will understand. That they'll read your words and feel as terrified and thrilled as you do. What you don't know is that half the castle already suspects something, that the steward saw the servant's nervous gait, that one of your ladies-in-waiting noticed your distracted sighs, your sudden interest in calligraphy, and that's all it takes. The letter doesn't even have to reach its destination. If someone finds it mid-transit, if it's intercepted or simply misplaced, it can be used against you. It's your confession, your signature in blood. You might as well have stood on a table and shouted, "I'm in love!" One notorious example, in the late 13th century, the Countess of Salisbury was rumoured to have exchanged romantic letters with a knight who wasn't her husband. It's not clear whether the letters were ever made public, but her name became tangled in court gossip, and the knight's career mysteriously stalled. Coincidence? Maybe. But in that kind of world, accusations didn't need proof, just a little ink and some imagination. Here's the thing. In a time before privacy as we know it, letters weren't protected. There was no guarantee that only the intended reader would ever see your words. They could be read aloud, handed around at court, or kept in a chest as ammunition for a future power play. And since handwriting was often recognisable, even anonymous notes could be traced. Your pen stroke, your choice of phrases, even your spelling quirks, all of it could betray you. Still, people wrote, because how else could they love? You couldn't declare your feelings in public. You couldn't hold hands in the garden without 20 eyes watching. But a letter, that was a whisper that could cross locked doors, a touch in the dark, something deeply personal in a world where almost nothing was. Some letters were carefully coded. People developed ciphers, used obscure classical references, even wrote in foreign languages to keep their meaning hidden. In a few cases, lovers used religious metaphors to mask their intentions, comparing their beloved to saints, or disguising desire as spiritual admiration. That way, if caught, they could claim piety instead of passion. Clever, right? Except it didn't always work. There's a quirky historical example. In 14th century Florence, a nun named Sister Benedetta was found to have exchanged highly emotional and intimate letters with another woman in the convent. The language was ambiguous. Devotional, yes, but also undeniably romantic. The church authorities weren't fooled. Benedetta was put on trial and later forced into silence. Her letters were preserved as part of the evidence, a permanent record of what she was never supposed to feel, and that's the terrifying part. Once your feelings were in writing, they didn't belong to you anymore. They belonged to whoever had the power to read them aloud in court, to twist them, to strip them of meaning and turn them into something ugly, something sinful, something punishable. Still, historians debate how widespread this fear really was. Some argue that love letters were so common that they became an accepted part of noble flirtation. Dangerous, yes, but not rare. Others believe that many letters were burned or hidden before they could ever be found, which is why we have so few surviving examples. Maybe both are true. Maybe every letter that's been lost was someone's desperate attempt to rewrite their own ending. You sit now, staring at the hearth. The servant hasn't returned. Your letter is somewhere out in the world, and there's no way to know who's reading it. You imagine the one you love unfolding it, scanning the lines with a smile, or worse, being interrogated with. It in hand, your words turned into chains. There's nothing you can do but wait. And if you're the one receiving such a letter, you read it like it's a flame, slowly, reverently, scared that someone will walk in and see your face shift. You memorize every line because you know you'll have to burn it before dawn. But for now, in the glow of a flickering candle, you let yourself believe in it, in the voice behind the ink, in the person who took the risk for you. Because that's what love looked like in the Middle Ages. Paper, ink, danger. You wrote not because it was safe, but because it was the only way to say what you weren't allowed to say out loud. And for some, those letters were the closest thing to freedom they'd ever taste. You're ducking beneath a tapestry-lined corridor, trying to make yourself invisible. Your boots barely whisper against the flagstones, but inside your heart's thudding like war drums. Someone saw you earlier, just for a moment. You were laughing, not with your husband, not with your kin, but with someone else. A spark, a glance, a little too much warmth. And now, the whispers have started. You feel it. The danger curling around you like smoke. Because in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just love that could kill you. It was jealousy. And jealousy didn't come quietly in this world. It came with swords, with slander, with arsenic stirred into your wine. Love may have been risky, but being suspected of love could be just as lethal, especially when reputations, land, and egos were involved. Imagine you're a knight, just back from campaign. Your lord greets you, but his gaze lingers too long on his wife. She offers you wine, maybe smiles with that unspoken familiarity, and suddenly there's a shift, a coldness in the room. The lord begins to ask questions with the edge of his voice. He watches you at supper. He keeps track of who you talk to and how long you linger in the stables. You're not guilty of anything, yet. But in a place where honour is everything, and masculinity is constantly measured by how well a man keeps his woman, suspicion is more than enough. Jealousy in the Middle Ages wasn't just a personal emotion, it was a public crisis. A man whose wife was rumoured to be unfaithful could suffer political embarrassment, social disgrace, and even lose allies. Entire family lines could be discredited over the implication that a child wasn't legitimate. And if you think people took that lightly, think again. One historical account tells of a nobleman in the 13th century Aquitaine who publicly challenged his wife's suspected lover to a judicial duel. The outcome? The accused man was killed, his body left to rot outside the castle gates as a warning to others. The lady in question was sent to a convent where she remained for the rest of her life. Was there any proof of an affair? Number. But proof wasn't necessary. Jealousy was enough to get the blood flowing. And women? Oh, they weren't immune to jealousy either, but they had far fewer options. A noblewoman couldn't challenge a rival to a duel, but she could spread rumours, manipulate allies, or appeal to the church. Accusations of seduction, witchcraft, or unchaste behaviour were powerful tools, especially when directed at women of lower status. Servants, handmaidens, even nuns weren't safe from a lady's wrath if she felt threatened. And sometimes, jealousy turned domestic. Behind the thick walls of a manor, a husband could accuse his wife of infidelity and punish her as he saw fit. In many places, a nobleman was allowed to discipline his wife physically, even lock her away with little interference. Love could make you reckless, but jealousy made people cruel. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. There was actually a medieval superstition that you could ward off infidelity by feeding your partner a stew containing the powdered bones of a faithful spouse. Yes, you read that right. Ground up bones, love potions, sure. But this was culinary jealousy with a dark flair. Apparently the dead were more trustworthy. Things got even messier when children entered the picture. The moment a noblewoman gave birth, people started doing the math. Was this child truly the heir? Did he resemble the father, or that suspiciously charming squire who delivered her messages? It wasn't just family drama. It was succession, wealth, dynastic security. And if enough people questioned it, the child could be disinherited, cast aside, or, if you're really unlucky, quietly disposed of. Even the church got in on the paranoia. Priests were often the recipients of jealous confessions, sobbing admissions, or frantic attempts to prove innocence. Some monasteries kept written records of these cases, not always with names, but with enough detail to piece together the social chaos jealousy could unleash. You might think of the church as a neutral mediator, but it wasn't always so clean. Priests had their own loyalties. They too could be swayed by influence, bribes, or gossip. And then, of course, there were love triangles. Because humans being humans, someone was always falling for someone who was already spoken for. Entire ballads were written about these entanglements, usually ending in heartbreak, battle, or exile. And while the stories often romanticized the passion, they never hid the cost. A single jealous rival could end not just a relationship, but a life. There's a major debate among historians about how these emotional outbursts were really perceived. Were they seen as noble defences of honour, or shameful lapses of self-control? Some say that jealousy, particularly male jealousy, was glorified, evidence of virility and pride. Others argue it was a dangerous weakness, a fault that could make rulers look unstable or tyrannical. Perhaps it was both, depending on who was jealous and who ended up winning. So now you sit, heart still pounding, wondering if that harmless moment of laughter has sealed your fate. You didn't mean anything by it. But the look in your husband's eye is different tonight. The tension at the table is thick enough to slice. Maybe nothing will happen. Maybe this, like so many things, will fade by morning. But maybe not. You think of the woman who was dragged from her bed by her jealous husband. Of the knight who lost his tongue for writing a poem to the wrong lady. You think of the whispering maids, the shifting alliances, the poisoned chalices. And you remember what everyone eventually learns in this world. Love is dangerous. But jealousy is an executioner with a very long memory. It's a grey morning, the kind that seeps into your bones before you've even left your bed. Rain taps the stone windowsill like a soft warning. Outside, the monastery bells ring low and slow, 1, 2, 3 times. That means morning prayer. But for a few unlucky souls inside these walls, it also means another day of hiding something that doesn't fit into a vow of chastity. Because tonight, we're slipping behind the sacred silence and stepping into a place where love, even in its quietest form, could cost you everything. Welcome to Scandal in the Monastery. You're not wearing silk or velvet here. You're in rough wool, the kind that never stops itching. You sleep on straw. You rise before dawn. You speak only when permitted. But you feel oh, you still feel. And despite all the rules, the prayers, the ritualistic repetition of surrendering the body and soul to God, human longing does not go quietly. Not in nunneries, not in abbeys, not in any stone sanctum where people try to pray the heat out of their blood. Picture yourself as a young monk, freshly tonsured, newly cloaked, and very much committed to a life of piety. Or at least, that's what you told everyone. But Brother Thomas? The way he reads Latin, like the words themselves are honey. The way he looks at you across the scriptoria table. You try not to notice. You try not to feel the flush creep up your neck. But he touches your hand one afternoon, just for a second too long, and now you can't unfeel it. And that's the beginning of the end. Because monastic life isn't just about devotion. It's about surveillance. Everything is done in groups, meals in silence, prayers in formation, sleep in shared quarters. You're never alone. Not really. Which means if something happens, anything, it's going to be noticed. And once suspicion is born, it grows fast, like mould on damp stone. For nuns, it could be even worse. Convents were meant to be sanctuaries from the sin of the world. Many women were sent there not by choice, but by family arrangement. Too many daughters, not enough dowries, or a little too much curiosity about the stable boy. Once behind the walls, they were expected to live in stillness and obedience. But the heart doesn't care about vows or veils. Sometimes it blooms anyway, finding warmth in a smile at morning mass, or fingers brushing in the herb garden. And when it did, the consequences were brutal. If two nuns were discovered in a romantic entanglement, they could be forcibly separated, publicly humiliated, or even excommunicated. Some were locked in cells for years, denied communion, denied visitors, denied light. If a monk was caught in a relationship, especially with a woman, he could be defrocked and expelled. If he was very unlucky and the scandal went public, he might face a secular trial, branding, or worse. One infamous case involved the abbess of the convent of Sainte Marie in the 14th century. Rumours spread that she had developed an inappropriate fondness for a novice under her care. The bishop got involved, a formal inquest was launched, letters were seized, witnesses were interviewed. The conclusion? The abbess was stripped of her title and quietly reassigned to a remote, crumbling abbey far from any town. The novice disappeared from the records entirely. It's not clear what happened to her, but silence is often louder than ink. But here's a twist. Sometimes the church covered up these affairs, not out of mercy, but out of pragmatism. Public scandals made the institution look bad. So, if two monks were caught in a moment of passion, they might be shipped off quietly to different orders, and the incident would vanish. If a nun gave birth, a horrifyingly common occurrence in some convents, the baby was sometimes whisked away and either killed or raised as an orphan. There were whispers of secret tunnels, hidden chambers, and midnight escapes arranged by sympathetic confessors. Love didn't just survive in these places, it carved itself out in shadows. Now for a fringe fact that feels too dramatic to be true. In some cloisters, locks were placed inside the cells, not to keep others out, but to keep nuns from sneaking off during the night. Apparently the temptation to climb over the convent walls or rendezvous in the gardens was strong enough to warrant architectural modifications. How romantic is that? Your passion was considered such a threat it had to be physically contained. And yet letters still passed hands. Glances still lingered. Psalms were sung with trembling lips. Even the most devout found themselves pulled into the gravity of forbidden love. Because when everything in your world is structured to deny you emotional contact, the smallest moments become monumental. A shared candle, a whispered confession, a touch that lingers during the passing of the wine cup. Modern scholars argue about the prevalence of these affairs. Were they rare deviations or quiet norms kept out of sight? Some claim the monasteries were stricter than a prison. Others suggest that emotional intimacy was so deeply human it became inevitable, and that the church simply turned a blind eye unless forced to act. It's hard to know, so many of the stories were erased. But what survives in letters, testimonies, and a few scandalized papal bulls paints a picture that's far more tangled than the official narrative. So here you are, caught in a life of silence, but feeling more than you know how to name. You try to pray it away, to bury it in parchment and psalms. But when the person next to you kneels just a little closer, When your fingers brush at the communion rail, it comes roaring back. The ache, the longing, the risk. Love wasn't supposed to follow you into sacred spaces, but it did. And once it found you, no amount of incense or chanting could drive it out. It's your wedding day. There's music, kind of. A procession of grim-looking family members, definitely. You're wearing something that took 6 hours to tie correctly, and you can barely breathe beneath the layers. Your groom stands next to you like a stone statue in boots, silent, stiff, and trying not to trip on his own ceremonial sword. You don't love him. You've never loved him, and he doesn't love you either. But here you are, joined by God and law, with no hope of annulment and no escape clause. Welcome to the medieval reality of arranged marriage misery. You're not surprised. Everyone told you this would happen. You've known since you were a child, when your name was first scribbled beside someone else's on the corner of a legal document you weren't allowed to read. The marriage is a business deal, not a romance. Your dowry, 3 acres of land, 6 goats and a wine press, isn't a token of affection. It's leverage. He gets your land, your family gets protection. Love doesn't even factor into it. And yet, you hoped, just a little. Maybe he'd be kind. Maybe he'd laugh at your jokes or ask what you dreamed about at night. But now that you stand beside him, both of you trapped in solemn silence, you realise that kindness isn't on the table either. You're not marrying a man, you're marrying an obligation, and the chains are already tightening. It's not just nobles. Even among peasants and merchants, arranged marriages were the norm. Romantic love might spark before or during a marriage, sure, but it was a bonus, not the foundation. If your heart was set on someone else, too bad. Parents, priests, and village elders made the decisions. You were expected to fall in line and then fall in bed, and if you didn't, well, things got unpleasant. Take the story of Marjorie Kempe. She was a middle-class woman from England in the 15th century, who after giving birth to 14 children, decided she didn't want to have sex with her husband anymore. She claimed divine inspiration and asked for a chaste marriage. He didn't agree at first. They fought. She cried. Eventually he conceded, but not without years of spiritual guilt-tripping and social shaming. Their love, or what passed for it, was never romantic. It was rooted in obligation, economic alliance, and shared suffering. That was the reality for most people. Some medieval law codes actually allowed spouses to be dragged to court for refusing their marital duties. If a wife denied her husband conjugal rights, she could be accused of rebellion. If a husband refused his wife, he could be labelled impotent. And believe it or not, impotence trials were a real thing, with public testimony, and sometimes, horrifyingly, physical inspection. Nothing says romance like a court-ordered examination. And here's the nightmare scenario. You're married, but you've fallen in love with someone else. Someone who listens, someone who sees you. But your marriage is binding, irrevocable. The only acceptable reason for separation is non-consummation, and that window's long closed. So what do? Some run, a few succeed. Most are caught, punished, and thrown back into the arms of a spouse they cannot stand. Or worse, you act on your feelings and get caught. Adultery isn't just shameful, it's criminal. For women especially, the penalties were harsh. Public flogging, facial branding, or forced penance. For men, punishment varied. Sometimes it was exile. Sometimes it was forced service in the army. Sometimes it was nothing at all, because men, as usual, had more wiggle room. But even they weren't invincible. A husband who cuckolded a nobleman could face duel or death. Love triangles didn't end with witty banter. They ended in funerals. Let's pause for a weird historical detail. In some parts of medieval Europe, there were marriage manuals written by clergymen to help couples navigate their duties. They included such timeless advice as, always ask permission before trying unusual positions, and do not perform the act on feast days. Imagine reading that as a terrified 16-year-old on the eve of your wedding, married to a complete stranger who smells like wet fur. Romantic, right? Scholars still argue about how miserable these arranged marriages really were. Some say couples grew to care for one another in time, that duty and shared survival forged real bonds. Others point out the high rates of domestic violence, the records of women begging for release, and the countless tragic poems written by men and women who were, quite literally, trapped. There's probably truth in both views. But when love wasn't part of the equation to start with, happiness always had to work harder to show up. And what about annulments? Technically, they existed, but they were rare, expensive, and deeply political. You needed a powerful ally, a sympathetic bishop, or a truly convincing story, like hidden incest, deception, or demonic possession. Yes, that last one was an actual excuse. For most people, Till Death Do Us Part wasn't poetic. It was terrifyingly literal. You glance over at your husband now. He still hasn't spoken much. Later, you'll lie beside him in a cold bed, staring up at the rafters while he snores and the candle gutters low. You'll wonder what might have been if you'd been allowed to choose. If you could have followed your heart instead of your family's ledger. But in the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't the beginning of a love story. It was the end of possibility. And yet, even in that bleakness, people still dreamed, still wrote poems, still watched from across the market square and let their hearts flutter at the wrong moment. Because hope, as always, is the most reckless and persistent thing of all. You're bent over a wooden table lit by a single flickering candle, grinding herbs with a pestle in slow practice circles. The smell is sweet. Honeysuckle, a hint of rose, and something darker underneath. You're careful with the measurements, whispering words you were never taught in church, your fingers moving like they've done this before, because tonight someone's coming to you for a love potion, and while most folks look to the clergy for salvation, they come to you when the matters of the heart. And in the Middle Ages, that's more dangerous than any battlefield. It's no secret that when love went unrequited, or worse, when it was never supposed to happen in the first place, people got desperate, and desperation turned them toward folk remedies, old charms and whispered spells passed down by grandmothers who kept secrets in locked boxes and beneath their skirts. You're one of those women now, or maybe just someone on the edge of society with the knowledge no one admits they need. Either way, your trade is quiet, careful and deadly if discovered. You know the risks. Using love magic was considered heresy at best, witchcraft at worst. Both were punishable by fines, imprisonment or execution. But people still came, slipping through the hedgerow after dark, leaving coins in your window box, asking for just a little something to make someone look their way. Because the church might preach patience and chastity, but when you're heartbroken, those sermons don't do much. Not like a satchel of dried roots soaked in wine and murmured over 3 times under a full moon. Love magic came in many forms. Potions were the most common, mixtures of herbs, flowers, and sometimes questionable ingredients. Some were basically medieval aphrodisiacs: mint, basil, honey, pepper. Others included things that would make your stomach turn: animal parts, blood, even grave dirt. People believed these concoctions could open hearts, spark desire, or bind lovers together forever. The idea of consent? Not exactly a medieval priority in these matters. And then there were charms, words written backward, symbols etched onto wax, bits of hair tied with red thread and buried under doorsteps. If you were bold, you might sneak a charm into your beloved's food or wine. If you were subtle, you'd wear one on a ribbon beneath your clothing, whispering their name under your breath at dawn. It wasn't love, but it was power, and that, for many, was enough. Of course, the church condemned all of it. Love spells were said to invite demons to corrupt the soul, to mock the divine order of marriage and duty. But the clergy weren't always consistent in their own behaviour, more on that later. What mattered is that you weren't allowed to use these tools, especially if you were a woman. A woman with power, after all, was dangerous. A woman who knew how to manipulate desire. Practically a walking execution warrant. Historical fact for your nightmares. In 1324, a woman named Alice Candlelit was accused of using love magic to manipulate her husbands. Yes, plural. She'd married several wealthy men, all of whom mysteriously died and left her their fortunes. Naturally, suspicion fell on her. Among the charges, her use of sorceries, incantations, and magical powders to ensnare men's affections. She fled before she could be burned, but her maid wasn't so lucky. She was whipped, tortured, and eventually executed. One woman's love life became another woman's death sentence, and the paranoia didn't stop there. In many villages, if someone became suddenly affectionate or abandoned their proper suitor, people started whispering about potions. If you were too beautiful, suspicious. If you were too persuasive, definitely unnatural. Women who dared to express romantic agency, whether by magic or charm or just sheer personality, were seen as disruptive forces. dangerous. The kind who could unravel marriages and cause men to forget their duties, which in medieval terms made them enemies of the social order. But not all love magic was so sinister. Some was sweet, hopeful. A girl might tuck a daisy under her pillow to dream of her future husband. A boy might carve the initials of his crush into an apple, then toss it into a stream to see how far it floated, a measure of how deep her feelings ran. There were songs sung at twilight, barefoot dances in the fields, and little rites performed with candlelight and hope. Harmless rituals, really, but still considered suspect by those who enforced the rules. Modern scholars argue about whether these love spells actually worked, but that's beside the point. They mattered. They gave people agency, however small, in a world where their choices were so often made for them. For women in particular, love magic offered the illusion of control over their marriages, their lovers, their futures. Whether the spell worked or not, the act of performing it gave shape to their longing. It made the impossible feel a little closer. And there's the scholarly debate. Was love magic subversion or survival? Some historians view it as a form of rebellion, women using the only tools available to them to reclaim power. Others argue it was just another symptom of powerlessness, a reflection of how desperate people were to control something, anything. Maybe it was both. Maybe every love spell was both a cry for help and a refusal to be helpless. So now here you are, holding a vial of thick, sweet liquid, still warm from your hands. The person who asked for it will come tonight, nervous and hopeful. Maybe it's a young girl desperate to turn her friend's attention from another. Maybe it's an older woman trying to keep a drifting husband close. You won't ask questions. You never do. But part of you wonders how much of what they feel is real and how much is just the spell. The rain's letting up now, the candle's burning low. You clean your tools and tuck the ingredients away in the hollow beneath the hearthstone. You'll never write any of this down. You'll never speak of it aloud. But the truth lingers in the air, heavy and scented and silent. Love in the Middle Ages didn't come with safety. Sometimes it came in a cup, and sometimes that cup could kill. The great hall smells of roasted boar, wax, and too many egos. Your goblet is full, but your appetite isn't. The table is packed with nobles laughing too loud, boasting about hunts, borders, and bastard sons. Your seat is gilded, your robes are fine, and across the room, making every muscle in your body tighten, is someone you should absolutely not be thinking about. Because you're not just any noble tonight, you're royalty, and that person you keep glancing at. That's the kind of love affair that topples crowns. You'd think being royal would make falling in love easier, all that power, all that privacy. And yet, it's the exact opposite. Every glance you steal, every gesture you make has implications. Kingdoms hinge on your fidelity. If you're a queen, your virtue is national policy. If you're a king, your mistress might be the tipping point in a war. There are no harmless crushes at this level, just careful calculations and explosive consequences. Take King Edward IV of England, dashing, popular, and prone to falling in love like it was his full-time job. When he married Elizabeth Woodville in secret, bypassing all the carefully arranged diplomatic matches planned for him, it sent shockwaves through the court. She wasn't of royal blood. She was a widow, the daughter of a knight. Scandalous, yes, but also deeply destabilizing. Suddenly, the Queen's family rose in influence, causing bitter resentment among the nobles who'd expected to hold power. Love didn't just disrupt Edward's personal life. It triggered a political powder keg that helped ignite the War of the Roses. And then there's Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II. Now that's a royal love story worthy of a Greek tragedy. She was smart, ambitious, and beautiful. He was driven, volatile, and equally brilliant. They married for power, but it wasn't long before passion turned to fury. Eleanor eventually supported her sons in a rebellion against their father, her own husband. The result? Henry imprisoned her for 16 years. Let that sink in. A queen. Locked away because her love curdled into resistance. Royal women had it especially rough. While kings could enjoy mistresses with little more than a wagging finger from the clergy, queens had no such luxury. If a queen was suspected of infidelity, it wasn't just gossip. It was treason. A single rumour could call the legitimacy of the heir into question, and in a world obsessed with pure bloodlines, that kind of uncertainty was enough to get heads chopped off. Literally. Anne Boleyn. Ring a bell? She wasn't born royal, but she became queen by convincing King Henry VIII to split the entire church in half. Bold move. Their love was fiery, manipulative, obsessive, and short-lived. After failing to give him a male heir, she was accused of adultery, incest, and witchcraft. Whether any of it was true still sparks debate, but that didn't save her. She was beheaded in 1536, and Henry moved on to the next woman like he was flipping pages in a grim romance novel. Fringe fact: some royal courts employed bedchamber spies. Yes, actual people assigned to monitor and report on a monarch's nighttime activities. Their job: keep tabs on who entered whose room, who left at what hour, and how many candles were lit while they were in there. Privacy was a foreign concept in court life, especially when a single whispered secret could shift the balance of power. And yet, despite the risk, despite the ever-watchful eyes, and the very real chance of execution, royal love affairs flourished. Letters were smuggled in the folds of gowns, rendezvous were arranged under cloaks of prayer and diplomacy, tapestries covered more than just stone walls, they hid stolen moments. These weren't just lusty flings, they were passionate, rebellious, and sometimes heartbreakingly sincere. Now, historians love to debate how romantic royal love affairs really were. Were they genuine emotional connections, or were they just power plays wearing perfume? Some scholars say it's all theatre, kings and queens using each other like pawns. Others argue that love did sometimes burn hot beneath the layers of strategy and protocol. The truth? Probably a messy mix of both. Like everything in the Middle Ages, the lines between politics and passion were blurry at best. And the damage these affairs left behind? Oh, it was real. Children born out of wedlock, called royal bastards, couldn't inherit thrones, but that didn't stop them from trying. Alliances built on marriages collapsed when love got in the way. Wars were fought not just for land or faith, but for personal revenge wrapped in political justification. When royalty loved recklessly, it wasn't just their hearts on the line, it was entire kingdoms. But that doesn't mean it wasn't worth it. For some, love was the only thing in their lives they didn't have to share with their advisors, their guards, their subjects. It was a secret flame in a freezing room, something personal in a world where even your children were national assets. So yes, it was dangerous, yes, it was foolish, but it was also theirs. You look across the Great Hall again, your fingers tighten around your goblet. You should look away, but you don't. You're royal. You're watched. But for just a moment your eyes meet, and everything else, the politics, the marriage, the war plans, melts away. There's only this moment, this glance, this quiet, treasonous feeling. Because when you wear a crown, you don't get to love freely. But that doesn't mean you stop loving. Your cloak is too thin for this wind, and your boots are caked in mud. You shouldn't be here, on this path, at this hour, under this sky. But you are. Because love doesn't care about curfews or curates. It only cares that they said yes. And now you're running away from your life, your name, your family. You're eloping, in the Middle Ages, which to be clear is only slightly less dangerous than charging into battle with a wooden spoon. There's no wedding feast, no priest in ceremonial robes, just the chapel up ahead, closed and dark, but with a sympathetic friar waiting inside. You've paid him well, or blackmailed him. Either way, he's agreed to say the words that will bind you together. You're shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the high of finally choosing something for yourself. A husband you want, not one your father picked after inspecting livestock. But let's not get carried away. This isn't a romantic comedy. This is the Middle Ages, where running off to marry someone without approval from your family, or your feudal lord, could be considered a crime. If you're a noblewoman, it might be classified as treason. If your lover is of lower status, it's even worse. Because this isn't just about feelings, it's about land, bloodlines, and inheritance. You've stolen yourself and the people who feel entitled to you, they'll want you back. And what happens if they catch you? Well, that depends. If you're lucky, you'll be dragged home, locked in your chamber, and made to fast for 40 days while a bishop unravels the validity of your illegitimate union. If you're unlucky, your husband will be flogged, possibly hanged, and you'll be forced to marry someone else anyway, with no further say in the matter, and that's the light version. One historical account from 13th century Normandy tells of a knight who married a young noblewoman in secret after her father denied his proposal. When the father found out, he rallied his men, burned the knight's manor to the ground, and hunted the couple through the forest for weeks. The knight was eventually caught and executed, his body displayed in the town square. The bride? She was confined to a convent for the rest of her life. Romantic, right? And even if your escape plan works, if you get married, slip away to another town and blend in, your troubles aren't over. Medieval law had a charming loophole where any marriage not conducted with proper bans, public announcements read at church 3 weeks in a row, could be declared null and void. That means your father, or worse, your husband's enemies, could argue that the whole thing was illegitimate. Cue the church stepping in to investigate your vows like a nosy aunt with judicial authority. Fringe fact for you. In some areas, if a woman eloped, her family could legally demand compensation from the groom. Not for her feelings, mind you, but for the loss of economic value. That's right. You, as a runaway bride, were financially appraised like a piece of land. Your scandal wasn't just personal, it was a property dispute. And yet, people still did it. They ran off, clutching each other's hands, hearts pounding because for some, even the smallest taste of freedom was worth the price. You might not have a dowry or permission or a long and peaceful life ahead, but for one night, you have choice. And in this world that's more intoxicating than wine. It wasn't just nobles or peasants. Even in the growing urban centres where merchant families jockeyed for social status, love still caused people to abandon carefully arranged futures. A shop girl falling for a tanner's apprentice, a weaver's son fleeing with the daughter of a spice merchant. Not exactly the stuff of troubadour ballads, but just as risky. Because the rules didn't care about your income level, just your obedience. And sometimes the church wasn't your enemy. There were rogue priests, minor clerics, even entire parishes that turned a blind eye to love marriages. Maybe they believed in romance. Maybe they just needed the coin. Either way, they gave desperate lovers a sliver of hope. Secret vows were whispered in Latin. Rings were exchanged beneath candlelight. Promises made that no one could erase, even if the church later tried. Scholars still argue about how common elopements really were. Some suggest that love marriages were more frequent than we assume, especially in less strictly regulated communities. Others insist these stories were outliers, kept alive by the sheer drama of their outcomes. But one thing's certain, for every couple who ran away, there were many more who wanted to, who dreamed of it, who planned right down to the hour and then didn't go through with it. Because fear won. But not tonight. You went through with it. You said the words. You kissed beneath a half-collapsed roof while rain dripped through the rafters. You believed that love could be a shield, that it could carry you through, and maybe, just maybe, it will. Though as you pull your hood tighter and look behind you on the winding road, you already hear the distant hooves. Someone knows, someone's coming. Because in the Middle Ages, love might make you run, but it never let you hide for long. You're standing in the town square, mud on your shoes, your hands trembling under your cloak. A crowd is forming, not because there's a juggler or a saint's relic on display, but because the bailiff has just nailed a parchment to the post. It's your name, or someone you know, spelled out in rough Latin and ink that's already smudging in the drizzle, and next to it, a list of charges. The words are hard to read if you're not trained, but everyone recognizes the big ones: adultery, seduction, and the dreaded violation of moral law. In the Middle Ages, love doesn't just break hearts, it breaks laws. You don't need a courtroom drama to feel the weight of it. All around you, people shift awkwardly, whispering behind hands, eyes darting toward the accused. Maybe it's a young woman who was seen walking too closely with a merchant's son. Maybe it's a scribe who sent one too many letters to the baker's wife. The law isn't shy about this kind of thing. Medieval towns didn't have much in the way of privacy, and they definitely didn't mind making examples out of people who dared to love without permission. What gets you isn't just that people are being punished. It's how strange and inconsistent the punishments can be. Fall in love with the wrong person, that's a fine. Get caught sneaking into someone's home after dark, that might mean a public flogging or, worse, being paraded through town in a donkey's harness. In some places there were even shame masks, metal contraptions shaped like grotesque faces, strapped onto those who'd committed sexual or romantic offences. You didn't just suffer, you became a walking warning. And it wasn't just about physical acts. The law, especially under the influence of the church, liked to police intention. if you wrote a love poem, if you exchanged meaningful glances across the market, if you even hinted that your affection strayed from your lawful spouse. You could find yourself answering to a local magistrate or, in more serious cases, an ecclesiastical court. Yes, there were actual church trials for love, and no, they weren't charming. Take the case of Etienne de Bourbon, a 13th century inquisitor who once tried a young woman accused of bewitching a married man with her songs. The trial involved local testimony, character evaluation, and several readings of the offending lyrics. In the end, she was forced to wear sackcloth, walk barefoot through her village, and spend 40 days in penance. Why? Because a man fell for her voice. Her voice. Fringe fact. In some regions of medieval Germany and France, there were laws banning night singing. Literally. If you were caught serenading someone under their window past dark, you could be fined or jailed. Imagine that. Love songs outlawed. All because people couldn't be trusted to keep their passions chaste after sunset. And these laws didn't apply equally. Of course not. If you were a nobleman, especially one with friends in the right places, you could usually charm or pay your way out of trouble. A peasant or a woman, though, very different story. For lower-class lovers, the law came down hard. Public humiliation, forced marriage, in some extreme cases, exile from the town. If you got pregnant, the court might demand you name the father, and if you couldn't, or wouldn't, you might be whipped and declared a public disgrace. Worse yet, if someone wanted to get rid of you, all they had to do was accuse you of romantic misconduct. No proof needed, really. Just a few conveniently timed witnesses, and suddenly you're defending yourself against charges that are impossible to disprove. It happened more than people want to admit. A girl rejects a suitor. Suddenly she's accused of seduction. A merchant's rival needs him out of the way. Boom, he's charged with unlawful intimacy with the magistrate's daughter. There's a scholarly debate, of course, about how strictly these laws were enforced. Some argue that they were more symbolic than practical, tools of social control, used selectively when someone needed to be silenced or shamed. Others believe that these cases were common and well documented, because love truly was seen as dangerous, not because people were heartless, but because passion, unpredictable, irrational, uncontrollable passion, threatened the very structures that medieval society was built upon. So here you are, heart heavy, watching the rain smudge ink and lives on the village post. You know the risks now. You know that love isn't just emotional, it's political, social, legal. You remember that couple who fled last spring, only for the girl to return alone, silent and pale, escorted by 2 guards who wouldn't meet her eyes. You think about your own feelings. That person who smiled at you a little too warmly last week, the one who passed you a note beneath the cloth at market. You still have the note. You haven't burned it yet. Because even knowing all this, even knowing how high the stakes are, you still believe in the possibility that love might be worth it. That maybe, just maybe, not all laws are just, not all punishments are deserved, and not all feelings are sins no matter what the bailiff says. But until the day comes when the parchment on the post doesn't matter anymore, you keep your cloak tight, you keep your gaze down, and you read that love note one more time in the dark, just in case tomorrow brings your name to the gallows board. You're standing in the centre of town, and every face you know has turned toward you. There's no music, no priest, no festival, just a thick silence broken only by the occasional clatter of a cart or a coughing child. A rope has been tied loosely around your wrist, not because you're going to be hanged, but because you're going to be watched, judged, paraded, shamed. This is your punishment, not because you stole or lied or even killed. Your crime, love, the wrong kind, the wrong person, at the wrong time. And now, everyone gets to watch you pay. This is the Middle Ages, and public punishment isn't just about justice, it's theatre. Your mistake isn't being handled behind closed doors with a fine and a private apology. Number. You're on display, an object lesson to everyone else who might get ideas about stepping outside the invisible borders of acceptable desire. And the crowd, they're not shocked. They've seen this before. A man caught in another man's bed, forced to crawl through town in a tunic of ash. A woman accused of adultery, shaved bald and sent barefoot through the square. Lovers tied back to back and dunked in the river. The punishment is rarely subtle, and it's never merciful. Today yours is relatively mild. Public penance. You're to stand outside the church for 3 days, fasting, wearing a coarse linen shift and a rope around your waist. People will spit, throw things, laugh. You're supposed to confess publicly and loudly, to say that you've sinned, that you're sorry, that you'll never love like that again. Whether you mean it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're seen saying it. Because shame is a tool here. One of the oldest and most effective. The church knows it. The town council knows it. Even your neighbours, yes, the ones who quietly cheered when your bread won the Harvest Fair prize, know how to wield it. Love in this time is policed not just by laws or swords, but by eyes, by whispers, by the ever-present threat of being made into a warning. You think of others before you, that widow who tried to remarry too soon, punished for not waiting the proper number of mourning days. The servant girl who was flogged in the courtyard after the Lord's son got bored and blamed her. The priest who vanished after someone found a letter he wrote, one that began, "To my dearest," and didn't end with a saint's name. And the punishment didn't always stop at shame. In some places, depending on the severity or the mood of the judge, people were branded, literally, with irons, on the face, the chest, or the hand, branded as adulterers, fornicators, or worse, so that even long after the whispers faded, the proof stayed. Here's a bitter little historical fact. In 14th century England, there were legal punishments for incontinence, which meant sexual behaviour outside of marriage. And yes, these laws were enforced. Fines for inappropriate touch, lashings for repeated offences, and forced marriages for those who had the audacity to get pregnant without a ring. Imagine that, being forced to marry the person who helped land you in court, even if you hated them. That's not a solution. That's a life sentence dressed as redemption. And there were more imaginative punishments too. In certain towns, couples caught in forbidden love could be made to walk in procession wearing matching chains or mock bridal garb, heavy robes of burlap, flower crowns made of nettles, symbols of love turned into farce. The crowd would jeer. Sometimes someone would shout a prayer, sometimes a hymn, always something sharp enough to make sure you never forgot. There's a fringe account from a German village where suspected lovers were made to sit facing each other on a seesaw-like contraption over a pit of manure. If they confessed, they'd be dunked together and sent on their way. If they didn't, the process continued until they did, or until the villagers got bored. Love, here, was not just punished. It was humiliated. And yet, even amid the cruelty, you're not broken. Not really. Because you know what the crowd doesn't. You meant it. The touch. The kiss. The letter. The late-night meeting. It wasn't a sin to you. It was a truth. And even as they yell, even as you stare at the church door through stinging eyes, you remember how their hand felt in yours. The warmth, the risk, the realness of it. And in a life filled with arranged marriages, silent meals and cold expectations, that brief, doomed love still feels worth it. There's an open question among scholars about whether these public punishments were genuinely effective in changing behaviour or simply served as social spectacle. Some argue that people became more secretive, not more virtuous. Others suggest that the constant public reinforcement of acceptable behaviour truly shaped the culture's collective psyche. But there's no doubt about the fear. The memory of what happened to someone else was often enough to make others toe the line. So here you are, rope around your waist, shift clinging to your skin in the drizzle, standing outside the church like a penitent statue. People walk past. Some avert their eyes, others smirk, a few mutter prayers, but no one stops the ritual. Because you broke the rule. You let your heart speak louder than your station, your title, your vows, and that makes you dangerous. But even as your knees ache and your stomach growls, you know this much. You've loved. You've felt something unfiltered and alive in a world built to silence passion. They can shame you. They can mark you. But they can't make you unfeel what was real. And that, quietly, defiantly, is your revenge. The sky is a sickly yellow-grey, and the streets smell of ash and something much worse. You step over a bundle lying in the gutter, too afraid to look closely. Could be laundry, could be a body. In the year of our Lord 1349, love isn't just risky, it's practically suicidal. Because when the Black Death rolls into town, touching someone's hand, kissing their cheek, even looking at them too long feels like a gamble with your life. Passion and plague are now partners, and falling in love during a pandemic. That's playing with fire in a world already burning. The rules you once knew about marriage, courtship, fidelity, they're unravelling. So many people are dying that priests can't keep up with the burials. Children bury their parents, parents bury their children, gravediggers bury everyone until they too disappear into the earth. In this chaos, the very structure of society begins to melt. Hierarchy, class, the rigid walls between who you should and shouldn't love, they crack like glass under pressure. You're a baker's daughter. You've never spoken to the apprentice from the apothecary across the square. But now, as plague carts roll past and the town bell tolls for yet another soul, he brings you herbs. He touches your hand without gloves. You don't stop him. You know it's foolish, reckless, possibly deadly. But in the face of so much loss, love starts to feel less like a luxury and more like the one thing still tethering you to life. And you're not alone. All across Europe, the plague creates strange pockets of connection, star-crossed love that defies death. In some towns, survivors cling to each other with a desperation that looks a lot like romance. People marry in haste, whispering vows not because they're hopeful for the future, but because they might not have one. Entire generations fall in love under the shadow of death, creating bonds that are raw, fast, and brutally honest. But not everyone sees this with sympathy. The Church, already overwhelmed and scrambling to explain why God has unleashed this horror, becomes even stricter. Love outside of marriage is blamed for the pestilence, adultery, fornication, desires of the flesh, all seen as reasons why divine wrath has descended. In sermons across Europe, people are told that the plague is punishment for moral decay, and that includes romantic sins. One historical account from Florence tells of a young couple who married in secret as the plague spread. They weren't of the same class, and they didn't have their family's blessing, but they wanted to face death together. When discovered, they were separated, locked in different quarters under quarantine. Both died within days, never seeing each other again. Their story, recorded in a local friar's journal, became a whispered tragedy for years. Then there are those who lean into desire. If the world is ending, why not take what you want? Love becomes frantic, physical, wild. Some people abandon their vows entirely. Monks run off with widows. Married women fall for gravediggers. Young men offer flowers to dying girls through quarantined windows. It's desperate, beautiful, and in many cases, deadly. Here's a particularly strange fringe tale. In some parts of Germany, a rumour spreads that kissing a stranger during a certain moon phase could ward off the plague. People line up in alleyways and public squares, desperate to find someone to lock lips with. Most historians agree it was nonsense, a folk tale born of terror and longing. But can you blame them? When your village has lost half its population, even superstition starts to sound like hope. What's fascinating is how the records from this time shift in tone. Before the plague, court records and church writings obsess over moral purity. But during and after, things get murkier. There's more mention of secret unions, rushed weddings, love letters written in haste. Some scholars argue that the Black Death loosened societal norms, at least temporarily, that people simply stopped caring about propriety when death was knocking at every door. But others argue the opposite, that the trauma caused people to tighten the rules again, doubling down on morality in a desperate attempt to restore order. The truth, like everything else in this time, is complicated. Love in the era of plague was messy, chaotic, and deeply human. Sometimes it made people better. Sometimes it made them worse. But it always made them feel. You pull your hood tighter as you pass the chapel. Inside you glimpse a man and woman standing close. Too close. No priest, no witnesses. Just two people clutching each other like lifelines. You wonder if they'll still be alive in a week. You wonder if they care. Later that night you read a letter by candlelight, one that arrived on a torn scrap of linen, its edges singed to sterilize it. The handwriting is shaky but familiar. If we must die, let it be with our hands entwined. Let me see you once more, even if it kills me. You press the fabric to your lips and cry, not because it's sad, but because it's so brave. Love has always been a risk, but in a world consumed by plague, that risk becomes unbearable and irresistible. It's a protest against despair, a fist raised against fate, and even though you know the odds are slim, that death waits just to sneeze or cough away, you still whisper yes when someone asks to walk beside you. Because in the Middle Ages, even when love couldn't save you, it was often the only thing worth dying for. The mud is halfway up your legs, your cloak's torn, and your fingers are wrapped tightly around a damp parchment smeared with sweat and ink. There's shouting in the distance, your commander bellowing orders, horses screaming, the clash of steel against steel. But none of that matters right now, because what you're holding isn't a map or a battle report, it's a letter, a love letter. And in the middle of a medieval battlefield, that single folded sheet is the only thing reminding you there's a world beyond blood and smoke. War has a way of pulling love into its orbit, whether it wants to be there or not. In the Middle Ages, soldiers marched off to fight for land, for God, for their lords, and often left their hearts behind. Some wrote, or tried to. With borrowed ink and crude Latin, they penned messages to sweethearts they might never see again. For many, those letters became sacred, hidden in armour, sewn into tunics, reread under the stars between raids. You're one of them now, ducking under a fallen tree, reading by moonlight. Your beloved's handwriting is messy, probably written in a rush. There's a pressed flower inside, a forget-me-not, crushed but intact. The letter smells faintly of rosemary and smoke. They write about the harvest, about missing you, about a dream they had where you came home with both arms still attached. It's not poetry, but it hits, harder than any lance. These battlefield romances weren't just sentimental fluff, they were lifelines. In a world where death came quickly and messily, love became a rebellion against despair. Soldiers would fight harder knowing someone was waiting, that someone cared whether they lived or died, a promise of home, of return, of something softer than war. But let's not romanticize too hard. These letters could be intercepted, and in some cases they were used against the writer. Enemies who captured messengers might mock the contents, reading them aloud before throwing them into the fire. A letter confessing love to someone already married. That could be used as political leverage or as grounds for trial if the writer was nobility. Love had no immunity on the battlefield, it just made you more vulnerable. Historical fact: during the 100 Years' War, French and English soldiers were sometimes found carrying tiny tokens, lockets, rings, or bits of cloth embroidered with initials. Some even tucked their beloved's hair into the lining of their helmets. It sounds sweet until you remember that in the chaos of war, personal effects were often scavenged from the dead. Finding a token meant more than just sentiment. It could identify a body, or worse, expose a secret. And then there were the women who followed the camps. Not all of them prostitutes, as commonly believed, but also wives, lovers, even secret fiancés. Some disguised themselves as men to stay close to their partners. Others waited at the fringes, offering food, care and stolen kisses between battles. Their presence was often illegal, their risks immense, but love didn't wait for permits. Fringe fact time: in a 14th century English regiment, a soldier named Thomas Golder was dismissed not for cowardice or insubordination, but for refusing to fight after hearing that his lover back home had been married off in his absence. He abandoned his post, walked hundreds of miles home, and was found weeping outside her cottage. Court records labelled him unfit for duty. Historians today might call it the saddest romantic subplot of the entire campaign. And while many soldiers clung to hope, others used war as an escape. Marriage back home felt like a trap. Duty, children, endless fields to till, war offered freedom, and for some, fleeting affairs. There are accounts of soldiers who fell for local women, forming brief but intense relationships before being deployed again, or dying in a skirmish. These were rarely written down, except in the margins of letters or in village gossip that survived through oral tradition. Of course, there's scholarly debate over how much of this was genuine romance, and how much was just wartime convenience. Did love flourish on the battlefield, or was it just a projection of longing onto whoever was nearby? Some argue that wartime letters were more about survival than sentiment. Others insist they show a deep emotional intelligence that challenges our view of medieval masculinity. Either way, they tell us something important. Even in war, people needed to feel connected. Even in blood, there was yearning. Now, back to you. You tuck the letter into your tunic and rise, your sides pushing forward again, and the sky's beginning to lighten with a pale, indifferent dawn. You move with the others, mud-slick boots, aching arms, lungs raw from smoke, and yet, something's different. There's a part of you still back at that tree, rereading every crooked word, every smudged line. You're not just fighting for glory or coin anymore, you're fighting for a return. for the chance to hold someone again without a sword on your back and death around every corner. Because in the Middle Ages, even on the battlefield, love found a way to follow. It rode in messengers' saddlebags, lingered in the scent of a crumpled letter, and haunted men as much as the screams of the dying. It couldn't stop the arrows, but sometimes it gave you just enough reason to keep moving forward. You hear the clanging before you see the fire, shields bashing against stone, boots stomping through dust, the shrill crack of something wooden being torn from its hinges. You press your back against a wall, heart hammering, because the village is burning. Again. Not from famine, not from plague, not even from some bored mercenary crew, but from love. The kind that tips kingdoms sideways and makes otherwise sensible people forget about things like alliances, borders and treaties. Tonight's carnage, it all started with a kiss, or a bed, or maybe just a look held a little too long between two people who had no business falling for each other. Welcome to the chapter where love starts wars. You know the trope, star-crossed lovers from rival houses. It's a romantic cliché now, sure. But back then, it wasn't just fodder for poets. It was a recurring disaster. Because when powerful families were at odds, love between their children wasn't adorable. It was treachery, a threat to the fragile scaffolding of status and land. And when enough tension built up, one reckless affair could be the spark that sent entire regions spiralling into bloodshed. Take, for example, the case of the Montagues and the Capulets. Yes, they were real families, even if Shakespeare added plenty of spice. Verona in the 14th century was rife with family feuds, and several of them had roots not just in politics or trade, but in scandalous relationships. The wrong marriage, a clandestine affair, a dowry dispute with emotional baggage. These things mattered. In places where noble bloodlines were the currency of power, romantic entanglements were nuclear bombs, and it wasn't just isolated families. Entire kingdoms felt the sting. Let's talk about Eleanor of Aquitaine again, because she practically specialised in love-related chaos. Her marriage to King Henry II of England not only unified massive territories, but also led to endless wars with France, especially when their children, yes, their children started rebelling. Family dinners must have been tense. Love, ambition, betrayal. They bled into each other so seamlessly that historians still argue where the personal ended and the political began. Now consider the tale of Peter Abelard and Eloise again, but imagine that on a national scale. Imagine two high-ranking nobles, one from France, one from Flanders, falling deeply in love. Their families have been competing over territory for generations. When the couple decides to marry in secret, what begins as a scandal soon erupts into accusations of treason. Armies are mobilised, towns caught between the two houses are pillaged, and for what? A private union turned into public warfare. Fringe fact, in the 15th century a minor German duchy saw a 2-year feud, complete with skirmishes, embargoes and hostage-taking, all because the Duke's sister eloped with a court musician. The musician was executed, the sister was placed under house arrest, and the ducal treasury never recovered from the cost of cleaning up their romantic rebellion. That's the danger of love in the medieval world. It doesn't stay small. Even the whisper of a forbidden liaison could be seen as a declaration of war. Because when someone fell in love with the enemy, they weren't just following their heart, they were threatening everything. Borders weren't just lines on a map, they were fault lines. And love, with all its explosive energy, had a bad habit of stomping around without looking where it stepped. And it wasn't always about noble blood. Even merchant families could spiral into ruin if one child decided to marry against the interests of the family. In Venice, there are records of rival guild families fighting literal street wars because of romantic betrayal. Love letters were intercepted and read aloud in public. Marriages were annulled by force. Entire shipping routes were disrupted because two teenagers couldn't keep it platonic. But maybe the most devastating example of love-igniting conflict is the story of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Her influence over him didn't just shift palace gossip, it rewrote the religious and political landscape of England. The king's obsession with her led to a break with the Catholic Church, the creation of the Church of England, and the execution of those who resisted the change. Thousands died in the resulting turmoil. Not exactly the stuff of sonnets, is it? Scholars argue about whether love was ever truly the cause of these wars, or just the excuse. Some say love was a convenient scapegoat, a way to justify actions already set in motion by political greed. Others believe personal relationships really did tip the balance, that passion in the wrong place could make kings reckless and generals foolish. Either way, the result was the same: fire, loss, and the gnawing sense that maybe hearts should have stayed in their proper chests, instead of wandering across enemy lines. You peer around the corner now, watching smoke rise above the chapel. The flames are licking the heavens like accusations. You know who caused this. You saw them. 2 lovers on horseback fleeing into the hills while the town turned to ash behind them. Maybe they thought they'd outrun it. Maybe they didn't care. Maybe they were just so desperate to be free together that they didn't stop to count the cost. And part of you understands. Because even as screams echo through the alleyways, even as blood stains the threshold of your favourite bakery, you remember what it feels like to want someone so badly you forget who you're supposed to be. Love has never been reasonable. It's never been safe. But in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just dangerous. It was capable of setting the world on fire. So as you flee down the back alley, lungs tight and eyes stinging, you wonder how many more cities will burn before someone learns to keep their feelings in check. Spoiler, probably none. The candles are low, and the cathedral's stone walls echo every step you take. You keep your hood up even though no one's around, just habit at this point. The safest love stories here are the silent ones. Hidden glances, lingering touches beneath the cover of incense smoke. Because in this world, if your heart leans towards someone of the same gender, you don't just face gossip or shame. You face damnation, exile, and sometimes a fire with your name on it. In the Middle Ages, being LGBTQ+ wasn't just socially taboo. It was illegal, heretical, and in some places punishable by death. But that didn't stop people from falling in love, quietly, fiercely, in shadowed corners of abbeys, in private gardens behind manor houses, between the lines of letters and the folds of monastic robes. Love, as usual, didn't care what the rules were. You live with this truth every day. You know how to smile just enough at the right people. You know what stories to tell at feasts. You know how to keep your voice steady when someone jokes about unnatural affections. But inside there's a name you repeat in your head like a prayer, a voice you can pick out in a crowded hall, a face that undoes you every time it turns your way. For many, the risk wasn't theoretical. Homosexual acts were explicitly condemned by church law. The 12th century Decretum Gratiani called it a crime against nature. Sodomy was a catch-all term applied to a wide range of acts, and it could get you excommunicated, imprisoned, tortured, or worse, and if you were caught in a noble court or religious institution. The punishment was even more severe, because now it wasn't just a sin, it was scandal. Take the tragic story of Richard Puller, a 14th century nobleman accused of having relationships with other men. Once rumours reached the courts, he was stripped of his titles and imprisoned. The official charge wasn't even sexual misconduct, it was dishonouring the crown, a political move wrapped in moral language. He was later released, but his reputation never recovered. His lands were seized, his name erased from records in some places. The people he loved forced to publicly denounce him. And this wasn't just a men's issue. Women who loved other women faced a double layer of erasure. First, for being romantically transgressive. Second, for being women in a society that rarely gave them a voice to begin with. Their relationships were often dismissed, hidden behind the label of deep friendship or spiritual sisterhood. But we know better. We've read the poems, seen the letters, traced the symbols carved into the wooden beams of convents and castles. Here's a beautiful, strange fringe fact. In 14th century France, there was a record of 2 women, both peasants, who were discovered living as a married couple. One of them having taken on a male identity for years. When they were finally exposed, they were brought before a local court. The husband was charged with fraud and blasphemy, but the court didn't know how to proceed. The idea of same-sex love confused them so thoroughly that the case was quietly dropped. They vanished into history, but not before making the world pause and blink. Of course, scholars still debate the visibility and frequency of same-sex relationships in the Middle Ages. Some argue they were more common than we think, just deeply coded. Others caution that we can't read modern identities into past behaviours too neatly. Maybe that's true. Maybe it wasn't about orientation, but connection. Still, you can't read some of these letters without feeling the undercurrent. Affection, desire, longing that dared to cross not just social lines, but gender boundaries as well. And then there were the monasteries, closed communities, isolated, silent, but filled with bodies and prayers and closeness. It's not hard to imagine what happened behind those high stone walls. In fact, it's not just speculation. There are historical accounts, some by scandalized abbots, some from inquisitions, that describe emotional and sometimes physical relationships between monks and nuns alike. These weren't just lapses, they were love, in places where love was forbidden. You light a candle and kneel, not to pray exactly, but to remember. You think of your lover's hand brushing yours during Vespers, the way their laugh slipped out when no one was supposed to be speaking, the letter hidden in your cloak that you haven't dared to read again, because the ink is beginning to fade and the words still hurt too much. And yes, sometimes the fear wins. Sometimes you stay quiet. You nod and smile when your parents mention marriage. You stand through the ceremonies and pretend not to hear the words meant to bind you to someone you'll never want. But in the quiet, you still hope. You still remember. And you know you're not alone. Because in every generation, someone like you has whispered a name they weren't supposed to, has carved initials into hidden corners of chapel pews, has risked everything for a love that no one recognized, but that was real just the same. In the Middle Ages, that kind of love was considered not just dangerous, but impossible. And yet, somehow, it always found a way to exist. The chapel smells like incense, damp stone, and something faintly metallic, maybe candle wax or dried blood from an old wound no one talks about anymore. You sit on a wooden bench, robes stiff across your shoulders, fingers tucked beneath your sleeves to hide the way they tremble. You've taken vows, sacred ones, poverty, obedience, chastity. You said them aloud in Latin in front of God, bishops, and a sea of solemn faces, and yet here you are, heart pounding like a war drum because someone smiled at you in the corridor. Again. Welcome to the strange and tender world of clerics in love. You're not supposed to want anyone. That was part of the deal. Monks, priests, friars, nuns, they were all supposed to cut ties with worldly desires, to live only for the divine. But if we've learned anything by now, it's that love doesn't care what you promised at your ordination. The heart wants what the heart wants, even when the body's been wrapped in layers of wool and guilt. Clerical celibacy, especially in the Latin Church, became official policy in the 12th century. Before that, it was more of a strong suggestion. Many parish priests had wives and children, and no one blinked. But by the time you're living, the Church has clamped down. Hard. Chastity isn't just encouraged, it's enforced. Caught in a romantic entanglement, and you risk your post, your reputation, your soul. And yet, you still feel it. Maybe it's the way she lingers too long after confession. Maybe it's the way he sings psalms with a voice that makes your skin hum. Maybe it's something as simple as shared silence that lasts a second longer than it should. Whatever it is, it's there. Unwanted, uninvited, but undeniable. Historical records tell us this happened constantly. In the 14th century, the English ecclesiastical court system was packed with cases of priests accused of incontinence, which is just the Church's very polite way of saying they weren't keeping their vows zipped up. Some of these cases involve consensual relationships. Others were murkier, tangled with power dynamics and class divides. But the sheer volume of accusations shows just how common clerical love and lust really was. And it wasn't always heterosexual. Some monastic communities became places where intense emotional and sometimes romantic relationships formed between members of the same sex. Letters exchanged between monks often read like full-blown love confessions. Were they spiritual, platonic, erotic? That's the endless academic debate. But when Brother Anselm writes to Brother Hugo that "Your absence wounds me like a sword, and I thirst for the sight of your face more than I do for grace," it's hard not to read between the lines. Fringe fact: in the late 13th century, a Flemish priest was caught keeping a secret apartment in the city, where he met his lover, a weaver's daughter, once a week. When discovered, he claimed he was offering her spiritual guidance through intimate conversation. The court didn't buy it. He was stripped of his robes, fined, and exiled from the diocese. The girl was placed in a penitentiary convent, but still, he tried. And women in religious orders? Same song, different lyrics. Many young girls were placed in convents without their consent, often because their families couldn't afford dowries. Inside, they found structure, education, and sometimes connection. There are stories of nuns who fell in love with each other, or with travelling clerics, or even with the saints they were supposed to worship. Their diaries, where they survive, are filled with the same yearning we see in the letters of lovers outside the walls. Longing doesn't stop at the cloister door. But when clerical love came to light, the fallout was brutal. A priest caught in a relationship might be defrocked, imprisoned, or even executed for heresy if he challenged church authority. A nun might be locked in solitary confinement or made to undergo public penance. Worse still, many simply vanished from the records, likely transferred, silenced, or buried under convenient illness. Scholars today still argue about the nature of these relationships. Were they outliers, or signs of a deeper unspoken culture of quiet rebellion? Some claim that romantic entanglements were seen as lapses, forgivable if the cleric returned to obedience. Others point to strict enforcement records and insist the church saw these as existential threats. Maybe it depended on the century, or the bishop, or how politically useful the scandal was. You shift on the bench, listening to the sound of footsteps echo down the nave. You know who it is. You'd know their gait even in a thunderstorm. They sit beside you, close but not touching. You exchange no words. You don't need to. There's a warmth between you that defies vows and vestments, and though neither of you will ever admit it aloud, in this moment, you are seen, known, loved, and maybe you'll never act on it. Maybe the fear of damnation will win. Maybe it should. But tonight, in the hush of the chapel, you allow yourself to feel what the rules say you shouldn't. You close your eyes, you breathe, and you let yourself imagine, for just a heartbeat, what it would be like to have their hand in yours without shame. Because in the Middle Ages, even the holiest hearts weren't safe from love. And sometimes, the most dangerous affairs happened right beneath the crucifix. Your shoes drag across uneven flagstones, and the cold presses into your spine like a sermon with sharp teeth. You're being watched. Again. Not by your husband, he's too busy polishing his family's name, but by the other women in the hall, the priest's wife, the chambermaid, the one who pretends to nap in the afternoons but always seems to know everything. They all glance your way, then pretend not to. You pull your shawl tighter around your shoulders, though it's not the chill that unsettles you. It's the way they look at you like you've already been found guilty of something. Because in the Middle Ages, it's not just men who fall in love dangerously. For a woman, desire itself could damn you. Maybe you've never said a word. Maybe you've only thought about it, about someone other than your husband. Or maybe you have said something, quietly, to yourself, in the dark, a name, a dream, a sigh into the pillow that wasn't meant for anyone's ears but your own. But that's enough. It's always enough. Because a woman who wants in this time, who reaches, who dares to feel hunger in her heart or her body, isn't just frowned upon. She's labelled, branded, and in the right or wrong village, she's put on trial. Desire for women was considered inherently unstable, dangerous, even demonic. The church painted Eve as the original cautionary tale, a woman tempted, who then tempted a man, who then ruined paradise for everyone. From that point on, female desire wasn't just suspicious, it was catastrophic. Wanting someone was bad, but being wanted, worse. That made you a threat to every household, every marriage, every social structure that kept the world spinning on its cold little axis. And so, women learned to shrink their feelings, to bite back the smile, the glance, the warmth. You didn't speak of attraction, you didn't admit to dreams. If you did, even in private, even in a poem hidden between the pages of a psalter, someone might find it. And suddenly you were no longer a wife or a daughter or a widow. You were other, a harlot, a temptress, a witch. Let's pause on that last one, because when female desire couldn't be explained, it was often blamed on the supernatural. A woman who expressed romantic or sexual agency might be accused of enchantment, of using potions or charms, of consorting with demons, because clearly no normal woman would want something so bold, so disorderly, so human. One particularly tragic case. In 1320, a woman named Elena of Bruges was burned at the stake after a jealous husband accused her of bewitching his wife. Her evidence of guilt? The wife had spoken aloud of a dream in which Elena kissed her. That was enough. Elena was tortured, forced to confess and executed, and the wife silenced. Her testimony never entered the official record, and here's a strange, bitter little fringe fact. Some medieval physicians believed that female desire was the result of a physical imbalance. Too much heat in the womb, wandering organs. Excess moisture? Yes, really. Women were diagnosed with conditions like hysteria and prescribed everything from leeching to enforced chastity to, in some twisted cases, forced intercourse, to cure them of wanting. But not all women denied their feelings. Some risked everything to act on them. Love letters in disguised handwriting, tokens exchanged in markets, quiet touches in church pews. They had to be clever, subtle, and always prepared to lie. And if they were caught, they paid in blood, status, or silence. You hear echoes of their voices in ballads. The girl who drowned herself after being promised to the wrong man. The widow who ran away with a priest and vanished into a forest, never to be seen again. The noblewoman who wrote poetry under a false name, lines that still make scholars blush 6 centuries later. These women weren't saints or sinners. They were human beings whose desire made them dangerous to a world built on male comfort. There's a scholarly debate about how much agency women truly had over their romantic lives in the Middle Ages. Some historians argue that while the law and the church were oppressive, everyday life was more flexible, that women found ways to carve out autonomy, especially in lower classes and remote regions. Others insist the restrictions were absolute, and that we shouldn't mistake a few brave outliers for broader freedom. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Resistance existed, but always at a cost. And that brings us back to you, standing in that hall, pretending your heart isn't racing when he walks by. He's not noble, not even respectable really. But he looked at you like you were more than a womb and a dowry. He listened. He remembered that you love the colour green, and now your world is off its axis. Because wanting him might cost you everything, and still, you want. You retreat to your room, you bolt the door, you pull out the scrap of linen with his initials stitched in the corner, the one you promised yourself you'd burn. You don't. You hold it against your chest and close your eyes, and for one stolen moment, you let yourself feel. Fully, fiercely, no apologies. Because even though they told you that desire was a sin, you know better. You know it's not evil to love, it's not wicked to want, it's just dangerous. And in the Middle Ages, danger always came dressed in silence. You're standing at the edge of the forest with a pouch tucked deep in your sleeve, the weight of its contents both comforting and slightly terrifying. It jingles faintly, not with coins, but with crushed herbs, bone dust, and a thread-bound charm wrapped in linen. You've walked 2 villages over under cover of darkness for this. Not because you're cursed or desperate, but because you're in love. And that's reason enough. In the Middle Ages, when love slipped beyond your control, people turned to the one thing that might bend the world in their favour. Magic. Not the kind with fireballs or broomsticks, no. The love magic you're holding is quieter, darker, and far more intimate. A charm tucked under a mattress, a potion brewed from rosemary, wine, and, if your source is feeling bold, some bodily fluids. A whisper into a candle flame while reciting a name. These aren't fairy tales. These are real recorded rituals people clung to when the heart wanted what it wasn't allowed to have. You're not the only one who's done this. Across medieval Europe, love magic was everywhere. In cities and farmsteads, noble courts and back alleys, people of every class sought it out. Because when prayers failed, when polite flirtation hit a stone wall, when arranged marriages left you cold and yearning, magic offered something no priest or parent could: the illusion of control. Love magic came in 2 flavours. First, the hopeful kind. You know the type. Spells to attract someone, to inspire affection or lust, to pull someone toward you. Simple enough. But then there was the second kind. The manipulative, vengeful kind. Spells to make someone stay, to render them impotent with anyone else, to cause pain if they strayed. This was the dangerous stuff. The kind that could get you hanged or burned if discovered. And make no mistake, people were discovered. One infamous case from the 14th century Paris involved a midwife named Jehanne, who was found to have made love potions for over 20 women, some married, some not. Her most popular request: a charm to bind the heart of a disloyal man. When the church authorities caught wind, they raided her home. The list of ingredients found included powdered coral, rabbit hearts, menstrual blood, and a dog's tooth. Johanna was interrogated, tortured, and eventually exiled. But her clients? Most of them got off with a warning. After all, they were led astray. Women using magic. Condemned. Men affected by it. Poor victims. One particularly strange fringe tale from Norway tells of a fisherman's daughter who allegedly carved runes into the wood of her lover's boat to keep him from sailing away. Not metaphorically, literally. The runes were supposed to make him too lovesick to leave port. He made it halfway down the fjord, turned back, and asked for her hand in marriage. Coincidence? Maybe. But the locals believed, and centuries later, her rune carvings were still etched in the hull when it was dredged from the bay. Of course, the church hated all of it. Love magic was lumped in with heresy and diabolism. It was seen as rebellion against divine will. If God didn't make someone love you, who were you to override that? Worse still, magical rituals often involved bodily substances, nudity, or nocturnal rites. Anything that looked like sin wrapped in incense and chants. Confessors were trained to ask specific questions about love magic during penance. Have you sought to use unnatural means to win affection? Have you called upon the names of saints in vain during acts of desire? It wasn't just about what you did, it was about what you wanted. But people did it anyway, quietly, carefully. Sometimes through wise women, who sold charms alongside poultices. Sometimes through books, grimoires hidden beneath false floorboards. One of the most infamous was the Picatrix, a magical text translated into Latin that included instructions for making talismans to inspire romantic desire. Historians argue whether anyone actually used these spells, but someone must have thought they would. Why else risk owning the thing? There's a long-standing academic debate about whether these love spells were truly magical or just ritualized expressions of hope. Some scholars view them as psychological tools, ways for people, especially women, to feel empowered in systems that gave them no real agency. Others insist that belief in their efficacy was real and widespread, a fusion of folk religion, pagan survivals, and sheer desperation. Either way, the ingredients were real, the rituals were practiced, and the consequences could be fatal. Back to you now. You clutch your pouch a little tighter and glance behind you. The moon's high, and the wind carries the scent of wet earth and burning pine. The person you love is asleep somewhere, unaware, or maybe they're dreaming of someone else. And that's what hurts most. You don't want to curse them. You just want them to see you, to feel what you feel. You kneel in the grass, dig a small hole, and place the charm inside, just like the wise woman told you. Whisper their name 3 times. Burn the sprig of mugwort. Scatter salt in a circle. Your voice is quiet, but the hope behind it is thunderous. Maybe it'll work, maybe not. But in a world where love is caged by law, class, and control, sometimes the smallest act of rebellion is simply refusing to give up. The candle flickers out. You stand, brush the dirt from your knees, and walk back toward town. You don't know what tomorrow will bring, but tonight, under a sky full of cold stars, you tried. You did something. You called out to love, and maybe, just maybe, it heard you. Because in the Middle Ages, when the heart cried out and no one listened, magic did. It starts with a whisper. It always does. A name said too fondly, a glance held too long, a servant who notices a pattern where none was meant. And from that moment on, your entire life becomes a series of calculations. Who saw what? Who might say something? And how far gossip will travel before it becomes truth? In the Middle Ages, your reputation isn't just what people think of you. It's a living, breathing currency. And love, especially forbidden love, is a currency sinkhole. It drains everything you've ever earned with just a few stray words. You wake up one morning and feel it shift. The way your neighbour suddenly greets you with clipped formality. The way your brother-in-law won't meet your eyes at the feast. Someone has said something. Maybe it's true, maybe it isn't. Doesn't matter. Reputation doesn't need facts. It just needs repetition. It needs ears and mouths, and the joy people take in watching others fall from grace. If you're a woman, the slope is particularly slick. In a society obsessed with virginity, fidelity, and obedience, a woman's reputation is tied not to her kindness or intellect or even her service to God, but to her perceived purity. You could be the most generous soul in the parish, but if someone thinks you've smiled at the wrong man one too many times, you're suddenly suspect, and suspicion clings like damp wool. A noblewoman might be able to cushion the blow, at least at first, Her family might rally behind her, issue statements of virtue, or bribe the right priest to speak of her piety. But if the gossip sticks, even the highest tower can't save her. She becomes that lady, the one they whisper about during sermons, the one no young man wants to dance with at festivals, no marriage prospects, no allies. And if the rumours are salacious enough, even her children's futures could be poisoned. For peasant women, the fall is even faster. A barmaid seen leaving a stable too late. A widow who doesn't remarry quickly enough, or remarries too quickly. Even a midwife whose very job connects her to the mysteries of birth and blood can be accused of having known too much. And once that suspicion takes root, it rarely dies. It spreads from village to village, like frost across the fields. Men aren't immune, but they're often treated more leniently. A young squire caught sneaking into a maid's quarters might be scolded, fined, or forced to apologise. But a young maid caught with the squire, she's labelled, marked, possibly dismissed, and left to survive however she can. That imbalance of consequences is baked into the fabric of medieval society, where female virtue is fragile glass, and male desire is just unfortunate. Still, some men suffer, especially when the stakes are political. A noble caught having an affair with the wrong woman, say the king's cousin or a powerful bishop's wife, might find his lands seized or his name struck from court records. There's one recorded case of a baron in the Holy Roman Empire who was caught exchanging poetry with a married noblewoman. The result? He was exiled to a monastery where he lived out the rest of his life copying psalms and slowly going blind. Love poems turned into penance. Fringe fact. In parts of Italy during the 13th century, local officials would post public shame lists, written notices hung in town squares naming those suspected of moral offences. Often the offences weren't even confirmed, but once your name was on the board, that was it. You were marked. People would cross the street to avoid you, your market stall would be empty, and your family, ashamed by association. Sometimes people tried to fight back. A few wrote letters to bishops pleading their innocence, asking for public absolution. Others married hastily to cover the scandal, creating awkward unions that pleased no one but the record keepers, and some simply left, packed a bag and slipped away in the night, hoping to start over in a town where no one knew their name or their reputation. Of course, the concept of reputation also had its uses. It was a weapon. If someone wanted your land, your position, your spouse, rumours could soften the ground. She's been seen with the miller. He lingers too long in the stables. I heard she laughs when her husband isn't home. Doesn't take much. A few strategic whispers, a priest with a weak spine, and suddenly you're the villain of someone else's ambition. There's still debate among historians about how much these reputational collapses really affected long-term life outcomes. Some say the medieval obsession with honour and virtue meant a single scandal could ruin multiple generations. Others argue that people were more pragmatic, that once the gossip cooled, things returned to normal. But if the letters, court records, and endless cautionary tales are anything to go by, it's clear that social death was sometimes considered worse than physical death, and much harder to recover from. You sit alone in your chambers now, staring at the door. You can hear them outside, maids chatting just a little too loudly, someone laughing in a way that doesn't quite feel casual. You clench your jaw. You know your name's been on their tongues. The question now isn't whether they believe what's being said, it's how long they'll enjoy saying it. You pick up your embroidery, fingers moving on instinct, not for beauty or productivity, but just to keep from shaking. Because in the Middle Ages, falling in love was dangerous, but being seen to love, and to love wrongly, was fatal to everything else you'd built. Your alliances, your security, your peace, and worst of all, your good name. Once lost, it rarely came back. You sit on a moss-covered stone near the edge of a crumbling wall, the last golden light of the day bleeding through the branches overhead. There's dirt under your nails, a tear in your sleeve, and the taste of salt still clinging to your lips. From tears or sweat, who knows anymore? You've been through it. You've heard every warning, seen every punishment, ducked every judgment. You know that love in the Middle Ages is a battlefield even when there's no sword in sight. And yet somehow, miraculously, love still endured. Not the polished love written in courtly poems or embroidered into noble tapestries. Not the dangerous kind that topples kingdoms or ends in dungeons. No, what you've seen, what you've lived, is the quiet kind. The stolen glance across a crowded chapel, the kiss exchanged behind a haycart at dusk, the promise whispered by candlelight even when both of you knew it wouldn't last. That kind of love didn't make it into the history books, but it's what kept people going, in the shadows of all. The danger, laws, rumours, flames, there were real couples who made it, who found ways to stay together despite the odds. There were peasants who eloped and fled across borders, building lives in towns where no one asked too many questions. There were noblewomen who used clever paperwork and forged letters to secretly secure their choice of husband. There were even same-sex couples who disguised their relationships as spiritual friendships, and nuns who stayed close in death, buried side by side as sisters in Christ with no one the wiser. History doesn't always shout about these stories, but if you read between the lines, look past the public records and papal decrees, you'll see them. A will that leaves everything to my most beloved companion, a gravestone carved with initials and a shared date, a priest who quietly overlooked bans and blessed a marriage others would have denied. Love didn't stop, it just got smart. Fringe fact: in a village outside Prague in the 14th century there's a record of 2 widowed tenants, one male, one female, who lived together for over 20 years without ever marrying. They paid their dues, cared for each other, and raised a girl neither had officially birthed. When asked by a scribe about their relationship, they simply said, "We had more important things than names." The scribe left the entry incomplete. Maybe he didn't know what to write. Maybe he understood too well. And it wasn't always about grand gestures or dramatic sacrifice. Sometimes endurance looked like 2 people choosing each other every day in small, unremarkable ways, sharing bread, taking turns feeding chickens, keeping secrets. In a world where love could be lethal, the quiet parts mattered most. You think back on everything now. The lovers burned, the reputations destroyed, the letters hidden under floorboards. The girls sent to convents for loving too freely, the monks who carved names into pews when no one was watching, the queens who married for alliances but still managed to find real affection, the soldiers who died with letters pressed to their hearts. So many risks, so many punishments, and yet so many refused to stop feeling. Scholars still argue about whether love in the Middle Ages was real, or just another transaction wrapped in fancy words. But that misses the point. Even when marriage was political, even when dowries dictated futures, people still found ways to slip love in sideways. Through gestures, through defiance, through raw, reckless hope. Maybe the most beautiful thing about love in this brutal age is that people kept doing it anyway. They knew the risks, they knew the cost, and they still chose to care, to want, to reach out, even if it meant getting burned. Because the alternative, emotional numbness, obedience without feeling, was worse. Love, even at its most dangerous, made life feel alive. You stand now, brushing the dust from your cloak. The sun's nearly gone, but the air is soft and forgiving. Somewhere behind you a door creaks open. Footsteps, familiar ones. You don't turn around, not yet. You let the moment stretch. Let the world be still. Because for once there's no judgment waiting, no trial, no whispered shame. Just this fragile golden moment. Proof that somehow, despite everything, love survived. And maybe that's the truth buried beneath all the fear and fire. Love didn't just endure the Middle Ages, it defied them. You take one last look at the path behind you. Muddy, worn, complicated. It's littered with broken promises and candle stubs, charred love letters and forgotten tokens. But it's also filled with laughter under cloaks, fingerprints pressed into wax seals and the glow of something deeply human, even in an age that tried so hard to snuff it out. You've seen it all now. The peril, the passion, the politics. Love in the Middle Ages was rarely safe, but it was never irrelevant. It was stitched into everything. Thrones, theology, trade routes, and trembling hands under a harvest moon. You think of the girl who kissed the wrong boy, the scribe who dreamed of someone they'd never touch, the knight who fought for someone back home who would never wear a crown. You think of monks and midwives and queens and outcasts, all holding on to something that the world said they shouldn't want. Not because they were foolish, but because they were brave. And maybe that's the final word here. Not love, or danger, or punishment, but courage. It took courage to feel anything in a time that punished feeling. It took nerve to fall in love when everything around you said not to, and it still does sometimes. So tonight, as the world outside your window hums with its own quiet storm, maybe think about those forgotten hearts, those rebels with roses in their hands. They walked before us. Not always happily, not always safely, but with fire nonetheless. And you? You're part of that same story now. One long, messy, beautiful chain of people who dared to love in the dark.